There comes a point where the body simply says, enough. Not dramatically, not with a grand collapse, just a quiet moment when the shoulders will not lift anymore. When the hands that have held everything together for so long begin to tremble, and something inside you whispers, I am so tired. Tonight, we will meet a woman who carried herbs up a mountain for 30 years and never once noticed the weight. We will sit beside a ferryman who rowed against the current his whole life until the evening he finally let go of the oars. There is nothing you need to remember from tonight. These are simply stories. Quiet, unhurried stories drawn from the gentle wisdom of the Buddha. Teachings that have helped tired hearts rest a little easier for over 2,500 years. You do not need to follow along. You do not need to understand anything. If sleep comes before the story's end, that is perfectly fine. That is what they are here for. Let your body settle into wherever you are right now. Let the pillow take the weight of your head. And let us begin. Tonight's first story comes from a village on the side of a mountain. A village so high that the clouds sometimes drifted through the gardens like slow, quiet visitors who had forgotten where they were going. It was the kind of place where the mornings arrived gently, in layers of grey and silver, and the evenings left the same way, folding the light into the hills, like a blanket being drawn over a sleeping child. She was an herbalist. She had been one for as long as anyone in the village could remember, and perhaps longer than that. Her garden grew along the upper slope where the air was thinner, and the soil was dark and rich from centuries of rain. Wild thyme crept between the stones. Rosemary grew in thick, silver bushes that released their scent whenever the wind moved through them. And in the early mornings, before the sun had climbed above the ridge, the whole mountainside smelled of earth and green things waking up. She would rise before dawn, most days, when the light was still the color of pewter, and the stone path from her door to the garden was cold beneath her bare feet. She carried a basket on her back, a wide, deep basket woven from willow branches, darkened with years of use, its straps worn smooth against her shoulders. She had carried this basket, or one like it, every morning for 30 years, up the slope to the garden, down the slope to the village, up again if she had forgotten something, down again before the evening turned the air cold. The basket, when full of freshly cut herbs, weighed perhaps 40 pounds. After rain, when the leaves and stems were heavy with water, it weighed more. She did not know exactly how much. She had stopped noticing a long time ago. The weight had become part of her, the way a ring becomes part of a finger. So familiar that the hand no longer registers it is there. Her back had curved to accommodate the load. Not dramatically, she was not bent in half, but there was a gentle, permanent rounding to her upper spine, a forward tilt to her neck, as though her body had quietly agreed to reshape itself around the carrying. Her hands, too, had changed over the years. The fingers were strong but slightly curled even at rest, as if they were always holding something just out of sight. And her shoulders sat high and tight, drawn up toward her ears like two small animals bracing for weather. She did not notice any of this. You do not notice what has always been there. In the evenings, she would sit at her wooden table and sort the herbs by type. the lavender in one pile, the chamomile in another, the wild mint in a third. She would tie them in small bundles with cotton string and hang them from the ceiling beams to dry. The cottage smelled of 100 different plants at once, layered and complex, the way a forest floor smells after rain. And she would work until the candle burned low. And then she would lie down on her narrow bed and feel, without quite naming it, the deep tiredness that lived in her bones, like something that had moved in and never left. She thought this was just how bodies felt. She thought everyone carried this weight. One autumn, a young woman came to the village from the valley below. She was a painter, traveling through the mountains to find landscapes worth capturing. And she had heard that the herbalist sold dried lavender and chamomile that could not be found anywhere else. She climbed the path to the garden and found the herbalist kneeling among the rosemary, cutting stems with a small curved knife. The morning air was sharp with the scent of crushed thyme, where the herbalist's knees pressed into the soil. The young woman sat on a stone and watched for a while. She watched the way the herbalist moved, efficient but slow, each gesture carrying a kind of heaviness that did not match the lightness of the herbs she was cutting. She watched the herbalist stand, lift the basket onto her back with a practiced motion that looked almost unconscious, and begin walking down the slope with the slow, careful steps of someone who has memorized every stone on the path. "That basket looks so heavy," the young woman said. The herbalist stopped. She turned, and there was a flicker of something in her face. Not surprise, exactly, but a kind of waking up. As though a sound she had been hearing for years had suddenly become audible. "Does it?" she said. "It does," the young woman said. "Your shoulders are shaking." The herbalist looked down at her own hands, which were gripping the straps. She looked at her knuckles, which were white. She felt, for the first time in what might have been a decade, the pull of the straps against her collarbones, the deep ache in her lower back, the way her breath came shorter when she walked uphill. "I suppose it is heavy," she said quietly. "I had forgotten." The young woman tilted her head. "How do you forget something like that?" The herbalist looked at the path, at the stones she had walked over 10,000 times. "The same way. You forget the sound of your own breathing," she said. "It is always there, so you stop hearing it. Does it hurt?" The herbalist considered this. She pressed her fingers into the muscle above her collarbone, where the strap had worn a groove so familiar it felt like part of her skeleton. "I do not know," she said. "I cannot remember what it felt like before." The young woman said nothing for a moment. Then she said, very gently, "What if you set it down, just for a little while?" The herbalist looked at the basket as though seeing it for the first time. It was just a basket. Willow branches, woven tight, darkened with years of sweat and rain. It was not chained to her. It was not locked. She could set it down whenever she chose. She had simply never chosen. She set the basket down on the path. And when she did, something strange happened. Her shoulders dropped, not all at once, but slowly, the way snow slides off a warm roof. Her hands opened, her fingers uncurled, and she stood there on the mountain path, with her arms at her sides and her palms facing the sky. And she felt a lightness that was almost frightening, because she could not remember the last time her body had felt like this. She did not pick the basket up again right away. She just stood there. The wind moved through the rosemary. The clouds drifted through the garden. And for a long moment, she was simply a woman standing on a mountain, with nothing in her hands. Her body had memorized the shape of the carrying. Even without the basket, her shoulders stayed high. Her spine kept its gentle curve. The weight was gone, but the impression of the weight remained. The way a path remains in the grass long after the walking has stopped. Tonight, if you are lying here with shoulders that will not come down, shoulders that have been held high for so long that you have forgotten they are not supposed to be there. You already know something about what the herbalist discovered on that mountain path. You have been carrying something, perhaps many things, and the carrying has become so familiar that you no longer feel it as weight. You feel it as normal. You feel it as who you are. The Buddha had a word for this. He called it para. It simply means the weight. Not the weight of something dramatic or extraordinary, but the quiet, invisible heaviness of carrying what you have always carried. And in one of his most direct teachings, he offered this observation, that taking up the burden in the world is stressful, and that casting off the burden is bliss. He did not say it was easy. He said it was bliss. There is a difference. Easy is something the world gives you. Bliss is something that arrives when you finally stop asking the world for anything at all. And perhaps, tonight, you do not need to cast off every burden. Perhaps it is enough to simply notice that you are carrying one. The noticing is the beginning. Everything else can wait. There is a story that does not belong to any tradition. It belongs to the earth itself. In a forest somewhere, a tree began to grow beside a heavy stone. The stone was lodged in the soil, and as the tree grew taller, its trunk pressed against the stone, and slowly, over decades, grew around it. The wood curved and swelled, wrapping itself around the obstacle the way water wraps around a rock in a stream. Not fighting it, not breaking it, just accommodating it, year after year, ring after ring. The stone became part of the tree's shape. The trunk bulged where the stone sat. The bark thickened around it. And if you had seen the tree in its middle years, you would not have been able to tell where the tree ended and the stone began. But stones do not last forever. Rain seeps into cracks, frost expands them. And one autumn, after a season of heavy rain, the stone simply fell away. It dropped from the trunk and landed in the soft earth below, with a quiet sound, almost gentle, as though it had been waiting for permission to leave. The tree did not straighten. The trunk remained curved, shaped by the decades of accommodation. But the weight itself was gone, and where the stone had been, there was now a hollow, a smooth, open space in the side of the trunk where light came through, and small creatures sometimes sheltered from the rain. The tree did not need to straighten. It had already become something beautiful in its curving, and the hollow where the stone had been was not a wound. It was a window. Light came through it in the early mornings. Rain collected there in small, clear pools. Moss grew along its edges, soft and green, and in spring, a wren built her nest inside. A nest so small and perfect that it looked like the tree had grown it on purpose, the way a body grows a callus to protect a tender place. The weight had shaped the tree. And when the weight was gone, what remained was not damage. It was architecture. It was the record of a life that had carried something heavy and come through to the other side, still standing, still growing, still offering shelter to whatever small thing needed it. Let us rest here for a moment. Take a slow breath, if you like. There is no rush, and when you are ready, we will continue together. There is another kind of carrying that this story has been quietly pointing toward. It begins not on a mountain but on a river, a wide, slow river at the edge of a town where the desert meets the water and the air smells of warm mud and sun-baked wood. An old ferryman lived beside this river. He was a tall man, though the years had taken some of that height and folded it into his shoulders, so that he stood the way old trees stand, not quite straight, but deeply rooted. His hands were the largest thing about him, wide and rough, and permanently tanned the color of the river mud. He knelt in every morning to push the boat off the bank. He had lived beside this water for as long as anyone could remember, and his boat, a flat-bottomed wooden craft with 2 long oars and a rope that ran from one bank to the other, was as much a part of the landscape as the water itself. The wood was dark with age and river stain. The oars were smooth where his hands had gripped them 10,000 times. And the rope, thick as a man's wrist, was frayed at the places where it rubbed against the posts on either shore. Every morning he rowed people across, merchants with their goods, farmers with their animals, children going to school on the far side, old women visiting relatives. He rowed them all, pulling against the current, which was gentle most of the year, but strong enough to make the crossing hard work for a man his age. His arms ached by midday, his back ached by evening, and by nightfall, when the last passenger had crossed and the boat was tied to the post, he would sit on the bank and rub his palms, which were calloused and cracked from years of gripping the oars. He did not complain. He did not think of it as suffering. This was his work. This was what ferrymen did. The river flowed one way, and he rowed the other. That was the arrangement, and it had been the arrangement for 40 years. His father had rowed this same crossing before him, and his father's father before that. The boat had been repaired so many times that none of the original wood remained, but the shape was the same, and the labor was the same, and the ache in the shoulders at the end of the day was the same. Some evenings, when the last passenger had gone and the dock was quiet, he would sit on the bank and watch the water move. It moved so easily, it never seemed to struggle. It simply went where gravity told it to go, finding the lowest path, curving around obstacles, pooling in the still places and rushing through the narrow ones. He watched it the way a tired man watches a fire, not thinking, just resting his eyes on something that does not ask anything of him. Sometimes, in the quiet between crossings, he would dip his cracked hands into the river and hold them there, letting the cool water run between his fingers. It was the closest thing he had to rest. Those few seconds with his hands in the water, the sun on the back of his neck, the sound of the current murmuring against the hull. But one evening, an evening in late autumn, when the light on the water was the color of honey, and the egrets stood perfectly still in the shallows like small white monks in meditation, something shifted. He was rowing the last crossing of the day, alone, no passengers, just himself, and the boat, and the sound of the oars dipping into the water. And his arms, which had been tired for years, but had always obeyed him, simply stopped, not dramatically, not with pain. They just grew heavy, and the oars slowed, and then they rested in the water, and the boat began to drift. He did not panic. He sat very still and watched the current take the boat. It moved slowly, turning in a gentle arc, drifting downstream toward a bend in the river, where the water widened and grew calm. The boat did not capsize. It did not rush. It simply floated, carried by the same current he had spent 40 years fighting. And sitting there, with his hands resting on his knees, and the oars trailing in the water like two tired arms, he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt the river moving beneath him, not as an opponent, not as something to be overcome, but as something that had been carrying him all along. He thought of what a traveling teacher had once told him, many years ago, passing through the town. The teacher had said something about how there is no fire like desire, and no pain like the burden of existence, but there is also no bliss deeper than peace. He had not understood it then. It had sounded like philosophy, and he was a ferryman, not a philosopher. But sitting in the drifting boat, with the honey-colored light on the water, and the egrets standing like small white monks in the shallows, he understood. The peace was not something he needed to row toward. It was the current itself. It had been there the whole time, beneath the struggle, beneath the effort, beneath the 40 years of gripping and pulling and fighting the water. He whispered something to the river. It was not a prayer, exactly. It was more like an apology. "I have been fighting you," he said quietly. "All this time, I have been fighting you, and you were only trying to carry me." The boat drifted until it came to rest against the far bank, where the reeds grew thick and the water was warm and still. A frog sang once and then was quiet. He sat there for a long time. The stars came out, one by one, the way lamps are lit in a village at dusk. First one, then another, then too many to count. The egrets flew away, their wings making no sound at all, white shapes dissolving into the darkening sky. A cool breeze moved across the water, carrying the scent of night-blooming jasmine from somewhere on the far shore. And the river kept moving, as it always had, as it always would, carrying everything that was willing to be carried. Perhaps you too have been rowing against something for so long that you forgot you could stop. Perhaps the current you have been fighting is not as dangerous as you believed. Perhaps the river, whatever your river is, whatever current you have been pulling against with everything you have, has been waiting patiently beneath the struggle for you to rest your oars and let it do what it has always known how to do. You do not need to know where the river goes. You do not need to steer. You only need to stop gripping quite so hard. And if your hands have softened just a little as you listen to the ferryman's story, if your grip on the day has loosened even slightly, that is not something you decided to do. That is something your body heard before your mind did. The stories settle in the muscles before they reach the thoughts. That is how it has always worked. That is how it is working now. There is nothing more that needs doing. Not tonight. Let us rest here for a moment. Let the breath come slowly. Let the weight of the blanket hold you. When you are ready, we will continue together. But there is a kind of weight that is harder to notice than the one in the herbalist's basket. It is the weight you carry, not for yourself, but for everyone else. And that is where our next story begins. There is a kind of weight that does not belong to you. You picked it up somewhere along the way. Perhaps when someone you loved was hurting. Perhaps when a child needed you. Perhaps when the world asked you to be strong and you said yes without thinking. And you have been carrying it ever since. Not because anyone asked you to keep carrying it, but because you forgot that putting it down was allowed. Let us explore a story about this. In a small town on the coast, where the fishing boats went out before dawn and came back after dark, there lived a woman who had been a midwife for 37 years. She had retired 5 years ago. Her hands were not as steady, her knees not as willing to kneel on cold floors for hours. But her body had not retired with her. Her body was still working. She lived alone now, in a whitewashed house near the harbor, with blue shutters that she painted every spring and a small garden of geraniums in terracotta pots along the windowsill. The house was quiet. The town was quiet at night, except for the sound of the water moving against the hulls of the fishing boats, and the occasional creak of a rope pulling tight against a dock cleat. She kept the window open most nights, because she liked the salt air, the way it settled on her skin like something familiar, something that had always been there. In the mornings, she made coffee in a small copper pot and drank it on the step outside her front door, watching the boats come back with their catch. The fishermen moved slowly, the way people move when their bodies have been working all night. Unhurried, heavy, satisfied in a way that has nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with completion. She understood that kind of tiredness. She had lived inside it for decades. In the evenings she cooked simple meals. Fish when the neighbors brought some, bread and olive oil and tomatoes from the garden when they did not. She ate at the kitchen table, which was large enough for a family, but had only one chair pulled out. The other chairs were pushed in neatly, waiting for visitors who came less often now. The house was clean. The house was always clean. Keeping it clean was one of the ways she kept herself from sitting still too long, because sitting still meant thinking, and thinking, for her, always meant worrying. She went to bed at 10. She read for a while old novels, mostly stories she had read before and could put down without needing to know what happened next. She turned off the lamp. She closed her eyes. The salt air moved through the open window, cool against her face. And at 3 in the morning, every morning, she woke up. 3 in the morning had been the hour. For 37 years, that was when the phone rang most often. That was when the knocking on the door came, urgent, frightened, a husband or a mother or a sister saying, "It is time, please come, please hurry." 3 in the morning was when babies decided to arrive, as though the darkness gave them courage. And for 37 years, her body had learned to be ready at that hour, alert, awake, already swinging her legs off the bed before her mind had fully surfaced. The phone did not ring anymore. No one knocked. The babies she had helped bring into the world were grown now. Some of them had children of their own, and a few had grandchildren. But at 3 in the morning, her eyes opened. Her heart quickened. Her hands reached for the bag that was no longer on the bedside chair. She would lie there in the dark, listening to the harbor sounds, and she would worry. Not about anything specific, just a low, steady hum of concern, the way a machine keeps running after you have turned it off. The motor spinning down slowly, reluctantly, as though it does not believe the work is really done. She worried about a woman she had attended 20 years ago, whose labor had been long and difficult. She worried about a premature baby she had held in her palms one winter night, so small that his entire body fit between her wrists and her fingertips. She worried about whether she had done enough, said the right things, been steady enough in the moments when everything depended on steadiness. These were not her worries to carry anymore. She knew this. The woman was fine. The baby, a man now, taller than his father, was fine. Everyone was fine. But the worry did not consult with reason. It simply arrived, like the tide, at its appointed hour. One morning at 3:15, she gave up trying to sleep and walked to the harbor. The air was cool and smelled of salt and diesel and the faint sweetness of fish. The boats rocked gently. The stars were still out, but the eastern horizon had begun to lighten. A thin line of grey that would become silver, and then gold. A fisherman she knew was sitting on the dock, mending a net. He was old, older than she was, with hands that moved through the net with the same automatic precision she recognized from her own hands. The precision of someone who has done one thing for so long that the body can do it without the mind. "You are up early," he said. "I am always up early," she said. "I cannot seem to stop." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Who are you worried about?" She opened her mouth to say no one. But instead, she said, "Everyone. Everyone I ever helped." The fisherman nodded slowly, the way old people nod when they have heard something they already knew. "The babies," he said. "Yes. They are grown now," he said. "Some of them have grandchildren." "I know. Then, what are you carrying?" She looked at her hands, which were resting on her knees. They were good hands, steady, careful, hands that had caught 1,000 new lives as they entered the world. But they were empty now. They had been empty for 5 years, and yet they were still shaped as though they were holding something. "I do not know," she said. "Something that is not there anymore. But my hands do not believe that." The fisherman set down his net and looked at his own hands. Thick, scarred, the knuckles swollen from years of cold water and rough rope. "I understand," he said. "Some mornings I wake up and my hands are already pulling. There is no rope, there is no net, but the hands are pulling." They sat together in the quiet, two old people whose bodies had not yet learned that the work was done. Perhaps the fisherman said after a while, "The hands will learn, but they learn slowly, slower than the mind." The fisherman went back to his net. The sky grew lighter, and she sat beside him on the dock, watching the boats rock, feeling the cool air on her face. And for the first time in a very long time, she did not try to figure out what she was supposed to be doing. She just sat. The harbor held her the way she had held all those children, gently, without needing to understand why. The light came up slowly over the water, turning the grey into silver, and she sat very still, and her hands lay open in her lap like two small boats that had finally come to rest. The Buddha once looked at the world of human struggle and made a quiet observation. He said he saw people floundering like fish in small puddles, competing and clinging and carrying, and he saw an arrow, so very hard to see, embedded in the heart. Not a dramatic arrow, not a wound that bleeds. A quiet arrow, the kind you carry so long that you forget it is there. The arrow of holding on, the arrow of believing that if you stop, everything will fall apart. Tonight, if you recognize that arrow, if you know what it feels like to carry the worries of people who no longer need your worrying, you are not alone in that knowing, and you do not need to pull the arrow out tonight. You only need to notice it is there. Now, let us sit with one more story. This one begins in a farmhouse at the edge of an orchard in a valley where the hills rolled gently, and the roads were lined with old stone walls that had been built by someone's great-grandfather and maintained by no one since. The beehives stood in a row along the southern fence, 12 of them, white-painted wooden boxes that hummed all summer with a sound so steady and low that you stopped hearing it after a while, the way you stop hearing your own heartbeat. The air in summer smelled of honey and warm grass, and the particular sweetness of fruit that is almost ripe, a sweetness that promises something but has not yet arrived. In autumn, when the bees grew quiet and the orchard dropped its leaves, the farmhouse smelled of wood smoke and dried apples, and the faint, lingering sweetness that had soaked into the walls over decades, as though the house itself had been steeped in honey. A woman lived there. She was in her late 50s, strong and capable, the kind of woman who knew how to fix a fence post, calm a startled horse, and bake bread for 12 people before noon. She had raised 4 children in this house, and the house still held the evidence of them everywhere. A mark on the doorframe where she had measured their heights each birthday, a dent in the kitchen table where a toy truck had been hammered too hard, a window that stuck because a baseball had cracked the frame 20 years ago, and the repair had never quite held. She had nursed her husband through 2 surgeries and sat beside him through the long, quiet recoveries, reading to him in the evenings, adjusting his pillows, making sure the medication was taken at the right time. She had kept the books, paid the bills, scheduled the appointments, remembered the birthdays, organized the holidays, driven the children to school and to practice and to friends' houses and back again, year after year, until the driving and the scheduling and the remembering became as automatic as breathing. Her children were grown now. They lived in the city, all 4 of them, with jobs and apartments and lives that she followed through occasional phone calls and photographs sent to her phone. The house was quiet. The children's rooms were clean and empty. The beds made with sheets she still washed once a month, even though no one slept in them. But she had not stopped carrying. Every Sunday, she drove 2 hours to her youngest daughter's apartment with food, containers of soup, fresh bread, vegetables from the garden. She cleaned the apartment while she was there, even though her daughter had not asked her to. She checked the locks, replaced the light bulbs that had gone out, left notes on the counter, with reminders about eating breakfast and drinking enough water. She ironed the dish towels, even though no one cared whether dish towels were ironed. She made the beds in the empty rooms with hospital corners, the way her own mother had taught her. She kept the pantry stocked as though the children might arrive unannounced at any moment and need feeding. Canned soups, dried pasta, rice, the particular brand of peanut butter her youngest son had eaten by the jarful when he was 12. Every Monday she called her eldest son to ask about his work, his health, his plans. She listened carefully, not for what he said, but for what he did not say. The slight pause that might mean he was tired, the change in tone that might mean he was worried about something he did not want to share. She carried all of them still, their worries, their health, their happiness. She carried it the way she had always carried it, close to her chest, with both hands, as though they were still small enough to hold. She carried all of them, still. Their worries, their health, their happiness. She carried it the way she had always carried it, close to her chest, with both hands, as though they were still small enough to hold. And the carrying had a weight to it, a physical heaviness that settled in her shoulders and her lower back, and the space behind her eyes where headaches began. She did not think of it as a burden. She thought of it as love. And perhaps it was love, but it was love that had forgotten how to set things down. And then, one weekend in early autumn, she got sick. Nothing serious, a fever, a cough, the kind of illness that arrives when the body has simply been going too long without stopping. When the immune system, tired of being ignored, finally demands attention the only way it knows how. But for the first time in years, she could not make the drive. She called her daughter and said, "I cannot come this week. I am sorry." She expected her daughter to say it was fine. She expected the conversation to end there. Instead, on Sunday morning, she heard a car pull into the driveway. She looked out the window and saw her daughter getting out, carrying bags. Behind her, her eldest son was parking his car, and behind him, a third car, her other two children together, with blankets and medicine, and a pot of soup they had made themselves. They came into the house. They made her lie down. They brought her tea. They tidied the kitchen, which she had left untidy for the first time in her life. Her daughter sat on the edge of the bed and said very gently, "We have been waiting for you to let us take care of you." The woman looked at her children, her grown, capable, strong children, and she felt something shift inside her chest. It was not sadness. It was not relief exactly. It was the slow, startling recognition that the people she had been carrying were standing on their own feet. They had been standing on their own feet for years. She had been carrying weight that no one needed her to carry anymore. She did not cry. She just closed her eyes and let her daughter pull the blanket up to her chin, the way she herself had done 1,000 times when her daughter was small, tucking the edges gently, smoothing the fabric, that small, ancient gesture of care that passes from one generation to the next like a language that does not need words. And for the first time in a very long time, she was the one being held. Her shoulders, which had been set high and tight for as long as she could remember, softened against the pillow. Her jaw unclenched, and some things in her chest something she had been gripping without knowing she was gripping it. Quietly let go. The soup was not as good as hers. The bread was slightly burned. But lying there, with the sounds of her children moving through the house, laughing quietly, bumping into things, arguing gently about where the extra towels were kept, she thought it was the most beautiful meal anyone had ever made. Not because of the food, because of the sound of their voices. Because they were here, and she had not asked them to come, and they had come anyway. Not out of duty, not out of obligation, but because they wanted to, because they loved her. And loving someone, it turns out, is not the same as needing to be carried by them. There is an old Zen story about this kind of carrying. Two monks were traveling together and came to a river crossing where the water was high. A young woman stood at the bank, unable to cross. The older monk, without a word, lifted her onto his shoulders, carried her across, and set her down on the other side. She thanked him and went on her way. The two monks walked on in silence. An hour passed, 2 hours. Finally, the younger monk could no longer contain himself. "We are not supposed to touch women," he said. "How could you carry her like that?" The older monk looked at him and said, quietly, "I set her down at the riverbank. You are still carrying her." The younger monk said nothing. He walked on. And perhaps, in time, he understood. Not with his mind, which had already understood, but with his body, which was still holding on to something that had ended hours ago. That is the teaching, offered without explanation, without commentary. The carrying was not in the arms. It was in the refusal to let go. And the older monk's wisdom was not that he had been brave enough to lift the woman. It was that he had been wise enough to set her down. You either hear this or you do not. And tonight, hearing it is enough. The old language has a word for the kind of letting go we have been listening to. It is patini saga, and it does not mean throwing something away. It does not mean abandoning. It means giving back, returning something to where it belongs. The worry you carry for your grown children belongs to them now. The responsibility you carry for people who can take care of themselves belongs to them. And the weight you carry because no one ever told you that you were allowed to stop. That weight belongs to the earth. You can give it back. The Buddha offered this gentle observation. Happy indeed are those who possess nothing. He was not talking about poverty. He was talking about this, the happiness of empty hands. Hands that are not gripping. Hands that are not reaching. Hands that are simply resting, open, with nothing in them at all. And if right now your hands have softened, if the fingers have uncurled just slightly from whatever invisible thing they have been holding, you are already practicing what the old monk practiced at the riverbank. You are setting something down, not forever. Just for tonight, there is nothing more that needs doing. Let the breath come slowly. When you are ready, we will continue together. And here, the teaching turns towards something we have been feeling all evening without quite naming it. The place where the carrying lives, not in the mind alone, somewhere closer. Somewhere the body has been keeping a record of its own. The mind forgets. That is one of its most merciful talents, the ability to smooth over, to file away, to tuck the hard things into drawers that do not open easily. But the body does not forget. The body keeps a record of everything the mind has tried to put away, every argument you swallowed instead of speaking. Every night you lay awake, running through lists of things that needed doing. Every time you smiled when you were not smiling inside. The body wrote it all down, not in words, but in tension, in ache, in the particular way your shoulders rise toward your ears when the world becomes too much. Tonight, let us listen to what the body has been trying to say. Long is the night to one who is awake. Long is the road to one who is weary. These words were spoken by the Buddha a very long time ago, and they are as true now as they were then, as true as the tiredness you may be feeling in your own body at this very moment. The weariness is not a failure, it is a message. And the message is simple. You have been carrying something for a very long time, and your body would like you to know. In a hill town built of white limestone, where the quarry had been open for 300 years, and the dust hung in the air like a fine, dry mist that never quite settled, there lived a woman who cut stone. She had been cutting stone since she was 16, learning from her mother, who had learned from her mother before her. 3 generations of women who shaped the rock that built the houses, the churches, the low walls that lined the terraced olive groves on the hillside. The quarry sat at the eastern edge of the town, where the hill dropped away sharply, and you could see the sea in the distance, a thin blue line between the white of the stone and the white of the sky. In the mornings, before the heat came, the quarry was almost beautiful. The cut faces of the limestone glowed pink in the early light, and the shadows in the deeper cuts were cool and blue, and the air smelled of mineral and dust, and the particular dryness of rock that has been exposed to centuries of sun. She arrived at the quarry each morning before anyone else, when the stone was still cool to the touch and the tools were cold in their leather rolls. She liked this hour. She liked the sound her boots made on the gravel path, the weight of the chisel bag over her shoulder, the way the quarry held the quiet of the night a little longer than the rest of the town. She would unroll her tools on the flat workstone, the chisels arranged by size, the mallets, the fine-pointed pick she used for detailed work, and she would stand for a moment, looking at the block she was shaping, the way a painter might look at a canvas before the first stroke. Her hands were the tools beneath the tools. They were wide and strong, with short fingers and nails worn to nothing. The knuckles were thick, the joints slightly swollen from decades of absorbing the shock of metal striking metal. And at rest, if rest was even the right word, her fingers curled inward, gently, permanently, as though they were always holding a chisel that was not there. She could no longer fully straighten them. She had not been able to for years. But she did not think of this as damage. She thought of it as the shape her hands had chosen, the way a river chooses its banks. She worked steadily through the mornings, when the stone was cool and the chisel bit cleanly. She worked through the afternoons, when the heat made the air shimmer above the quarry floor and the sweat ran down her forearms and dripped onto the limestone, leaving dark spots that evaporated almost instantly. She drank water from a clay jug she kept in the shade of a slab, and she ate bread and cheese at midday. Sitting on a cut block with her legs hanging over the edge, looking at the sea in the distance, while the dust settled around her like fine, dry snow. By evening, when she walked back down the hill to her house, her whole body hummed with a tiredness so deep it felt like gravity had doubled. Her feet were heavy, her arms hung loose, and there was a particular ache in the space between her shoulder blades. A burning, persistent knot that no amount of stretching or rubbing could reach, as though something had lodged itself deep in the muscle and decided to stay. What she did not notice, what she had stopped noticing the way the herbalist had stopped noticing her basket, was the rest of it. The way her shoulders sat high and rigid, even when she was sitting at her kitchen table eating dinner. The way her jaw clenched in her sleep, so tightly that she sometimes woke with a headache that started at her temples and wrapped around the back of her skull like a band of iron. The way her breath came shallow and quick, even when she was doing nothing at all, as though her lungs were bracing for a blow that never arrived. The stone remembered everything. Every year of labor was recorded in the fine white dust that had settled into the creases of her skin. Every swing of the mallet was recorded in the thickness of her forearms. But it was not only the physical work that the body had kept track of. It was the other things too. The years of raising her children alone after her husband left. The nights of lying awake, calculating whether there was enough money for shoes and school books. The arguments with her sister that she had carried in her chest, like a stone of their own, hard and smooth and impossible to put down. One afternoon in late summer, when the heat made the quarry shimmer and the dust hung motionless in the still air, she noticed blood on the chisel. She stopped. She looked at her right hand. The skin across her palm had cracked, a thin, clean split along the line where the chisel handle pressed hardest. It was not a cut from the stone. It was a crack from the inside, the way dry earth cracks when it has gone too long without rain. She wrapped her hand in a cloth and kept working. But the crack opened again the next day, and the day after that. And on the fourth day, she walked down the hill to see the old woman who lived at the edge of the town, the one people went to when the doctor's medicine did not reach the kind of hurt they were carrying. The old woman took her hand and held it gently, turning it this way and that, pressing her thumb into the muscles of the palm, feeling the tension in the tendons, the swelling in the joints. She did not speak for a long time. "Your hands are not injured," she said finally. "Then why are they cracking?" "They are remembering," the old woman said. "Everything you have held, everything you have gripped, everything you have refused to let go of. Your hands are remembering it all, and they are tired of holding." The stonecutter looked at her hands as though seeing them for the first time. These hands that had shaped limestone into lintels and door frames and window arches. These hands that had held her children when they were small. These hands that had gripped the edge of the kitchen table during the hard years, white-knuckled, holding on. "What do I do?" she asked. "You let them forget," the old woman said. "Not forever, just for a little while. Each evening, warm water, still hands, let them open. Let them hold nothing." She began that evening. She filled a basin with warm water and set it on the kitchen table and lowered her hands into it. The warmth moved into her fingers slowly, the way warmth moves into anything that has been cold for a long time. Cautiously, gently, as though asking permission, her fingers uncurled, Not all the way, just a little, just enough. And she sat there in the quiet kitchen, with her hands in the warm water, and the evening light coming through the window, and she felt something release, not in her hands, but deeper, somewhere behind her ribs. A tightness she had not known was there until it began to soften. She did this every evening after that. It did not fix anything. Her hands were still curled in the morning. Her shoulders were still high. Her jaw still clenched in her sleep. But for those few minutes each evening, with the warm water and the quiet and the letting go, her body remembered what it felt like to not be holding on, and that, remembering, small as it was enough. The body writes its own scripture, not in words but in sensation. The tightness in the chest, the ache behind the eyes, the heaviness in the limbs that no amount of sleep seems to cure. The Buddha called this Vedana, not emotion, not thought, but the raw feeling that rises before the mind has decided what to call it. The body's quiet report. And the report does not lie. It does not exaggerate. It simply tells you what is true. In the only language it knows, there is a stone in a river. It has been there for 100 years, perhaps longer. The water moves over it constantly, not violently, not with force, but with the quiet persistence of something that has nowhere else to be. And over those 100 years, the water has changed the stone. It has smoothed the edges. It has worn away the roughness. It has taken what was angular and made it round, what was heavy and made it lighter, what was sharp and made it gentle. The stone did not choose this. The stone did not decide to become smooth. The water decided for it, or rather, neither decided, and it happened anyway, the way things happen when you stop fighting and let the current do its work. The stone is smaller now than it was. It has lost material. It has lost weight, but it has not lost anything that mattered. What remains is essential, the core, the center, the part that was always there beneath the roughness, waiting to be revealed. And perhaps this is what tiredness is, when you let it be, not a punishment, but a wearing away, not a breaking down, but a smoothing. The body, tired of carrying, begins to release what is not essential. The sharp edges of worry soften, the rough surfaces of anxiety grow smooth, and what remains, underneath all of it, is something surprisingly light. Let us rest here for a moment and listen to one more story before we continue. In the mountains of a country far from here, there was a temple so old that no one could remember when it had been built. The temple was small, just a meditation hall, a kitchen, a garden, and a bell tower that stood at the edge of a cliff, overlooking a valley so deep that clouds gathered below the temple rather than above it. On clear mornings, the valley floor was invisible, hidden beneath a sea of white mist, and the temple seemed to float above the world, like something that had been placed there by a hand too gentle to leave a mark. The bell in the tower was bronze, green with centuries of weather, and it was the largest thing in the temple, taller than a man, wider than the doorway it had been carried through, so heavy that the wooden beam from which it hung had been replaced 3 times in living memory. The bell had a sound that people in the valley described differently depending on when they heard it. In the early morning, it sounded like a question. In the evening, it sounded like an answer. And in the deep quiet after midnight, when the bell ringer struck it once and let it fade, It sounded like nothing else in the world, a sound that was not a sound so much as a vibration, a trembling in the air that you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears. An old man had been ringing this bell for 40 years. He was thin and quiet, with the kind of stillness that comes not from inactivity, but from having done one thing for so long, that the doing and the being have become the same. He rang the bell at dawn, he rang it at noon, he rang it at dusk, and once, in the deep middle of the night, he rang it for no reason that anyone could explain. Because the silence needed it, perhaps, or because the bell needed it, or because he did. He had an apprentice now, a young man who had come to the temple 3 years ago and had been learning the rhythms of the bell ever since. The weight of the wooden beam, the angle of the swing, the precise moment of contact when bronze met wood and the sound was born. The apprentice was earnest and careful, and struck the bell with great concentration, leaning into each swing as though the sound depended on his effort. One morning, as the mist rose from the valley and the first light caught the green surface of the bell, the apprentice asked the question he had been holding for a long time. What is the most important part of ringing the bell? The old man did not answer immediately. He stood beside the bell, one hand resting lightly on its surface, feeling the coolness of the bronze, the fine texture of the patina that centuries of rain and wind had etched into the metal. A bird called from somewhere below the cliff. The mist shifted. The silence after the strike, he said. The apprentice waited for more. The old man did not offer more. I do not understand, the apprentice said. The silence is just the absence of sound. How can it be more important than the sound itself? The old man smiled, a small, quiet smile, the kind that comes from having answered this question many times, in many different ways, without ever quite finding the words that work. When you carry a heavy stone, he said, which matters more, the carrying or the moment you set it down? The apprentice thought about this. The moment you set it down, the old man said, not waiting for an answer, because that is when you feel the weight. That is when the body says, ah, so this is what lightness is. The silence after the bell is the setting down. It is where the teaching lives. You will understand, he added, when you stop trying to make the sound and let the bell make it for you, you will understand. The bell does its best work when you let it rest. The sound travels farther in the silence than it ever does in the striking. Your job is not to create the sound. Your job is to create the silence that carries it. The apprentice struck the bell that morning with less force than usual. Not because he was being cautious, but because something in the old man's words had loosened the grip in his shoulders. And when the strike came and the sound rose, deep and full and slow, spreading outward through the mist like a ripple through still water, he did something he had never done before. He let go of the beam. He stepped back and he listened. The sound moved through the valley for a very long time. It moved past the trees and through the mist and over the rooftops of the village far below. And long after the sound had faded past the edge of hearing, the vibration remained. In the air, in the stone floor of the bell tower, in the apprentice's chest, where it settled like a small, warm animal finding its place to rest. The old bell ringer was sitting on the steps of the tower, his eyes half closed, his hands resting open on his knees. The morning light had reached him now, warming the thin fabric of his robe, turning the mist around the tower to gold. He looked like a man who had just set down something very heavy. Or, perhaps, and this is closer to the truth, he looked like a man who had learned, a long time ago, that the silence between the strikes was not empty. It was full. Full of everything the sound had set loose and let go. The apprentice sat down beside him. Neither of them spoke. The mist drifted through the valley below, and the bell, high above them, continued to hum, so quietly now that it was almost indistinguishable from the silence itself. There is a poem by an old Zen monk named Ryokan, who lived alone in a mountain hut and owned almost nothing. He wrote, "When all thoughts are exhausted, I slip into the woods and gather a pile of shepherd's purse. That is all. No grand teaching, no elaborate philosophy. Just the quiet act of a man whose mind has finally stopped reaching, and whose hands have found something simple and small to hold, not because he needs it, but because the holding without grasping is its own kind of rest." Perhaps, as you lie here listening, your body has already begun its own quiet letting go. Perhaps the shoulders have dropped a fraction of an inch, not because you told them to, but because the stories have been speaking to the muscles directly, bypassing the mind entirely. Perhaps the jaw has softened. Perhaps the space between your eyebrows has smoothed. These are not things you need to create. They are things your body remembers when the mind stops telling it what to feel. That is what bodies do. They remember how to rest. They have always known. They were just waiting for permission. Let us rest here for a moment. Take a breath if you like. Let the weight of the blanket hold you. When you are ready, we will continue together. And perhaps, hearing all of this, something in you has already begun to ask a question the body has been asking for a very long time, quietly, in its own language of ache and tension and tiredness. The question is simple. It does not need an answer tonight. It only needs to be heard. And the question is this: what would happen if I put this down? There is a very small thing that happens 100 times a day, so ordinary that you have probably never thought about it. You put something down, a cup, a bag, a set of keys. Your hand opens, the object leaves your fingers, and you walk away. You do not mourn the cup. You do not worry about the bag. You simply set it down because you no longer need to carry it, and your hand is free again, and you move on. But there are other things that are not cups or bags or keys, that we carry for years, for decades, and never think to set down. Not because we cannot, but because somewhere along the way, we decided that putting them down would mean something terrible. That it would mean we had failed. That it would mean we did not care enough. That it would mean the carrying had been for nothing. Tonight, let us look at the courage it takes to open the hand. Because it is courage. Make no mistake about that. The world will tell you that holding on is strong and letting go is weak. But anyone who has ever truly let go of something they carried for years knows that the opposite is true. The holding is the easy part. The letting go is where the bravery lives. There is an old Zen teaching about this. A monk came to visit a master, walking a long distance through the mountains, carrying a heavy bundle wrapped in cloth. He was tired, his shoulders ached, He set the bundle down in front of the master and bowed. The master looked at him and said one word, "Put it down." The monk looked at the bundle. "I have already put it down," he said. "I was not talking about the bundle," the master said. The monk stood very still. The master watched him with the patience of someone who has watched many people stand very still in exactly this way. The moment before understanding arrives, the moment when the body knows something the mind has not yet caught up with. "Now," the master said, "pick it up." The monk hesitated. "But you told me to put it down." "Yes, and you did. The first putting down was for your body. But there is a second putting down, the one that happens inside. And once you have truly put it down inside, you can pick up anything you like, and it will never weigh the same." The monk looked at his bundle. He picked it up. It was the same bundle, same cloth, same contents, same weight. But the monk carried it differently now. His shoulders were lower. His grip was lighter. Something had shifted, not in the bundle, but in the space between the bundle and the man carrying it. The Buddha spoke of this with great simplicity and directness. He said, "Casting off the burden is bliss. Having pulled up craving along with its root, one is free from hunger and unbound." He was not describing a distant enlightenment. He was describing a very specific sensation, the bliss of the moment after you let go. Not the letting go itself, which can be frightening, but the moment after, when the hands are empty and the body realizes, with a kind of quiet astonishment, that it is still standing, that nothing has collapsed, that the world did not end when you opened your fingers. In a small town at the edge of a river, in a house with a workshop behind it and a garden that had long ago gone to seed, there lived a woman who wove baskets. She had been weaving baskets for 50 years, since she was a girl of 20, sitting beside her grandmother on the bank of the river, where the willows grew thick and low, their branches trailing in the current like long green fingers. Her grandmother had taught her everything, how to select the right branches, the ones that were young enough to bend but old enough to hold their shape, how to soak them in the river until the bark loosened and the wood beneath turned the color of cream, how to coax them into shapes that were both useful and beautiful, with hands that were patient and firm and never in a hurry. The workshop was her favorite room in the world. It was long and narrow, with a packed earth floor and a single window at the far end that let in a rectangle of light that moved across the room as the day progressed, like a slow, golden visitor. The ceiling beams were low and dark, hung with bundles of dried reeds that rustled softly when the door was opened. The air smelled of willow and river water, and the faint sweetness of beeswax she used to seal the finished baskets. And along every wall, on every shelf, on every available surface, there were baskets, not finished baskets, unfinished ones. Each basket on those shelves represented a customer who had ordered it and never returned. A woman who had asked for a market basket, wide and shallow, with handles strong enough to carry vegetables from the morning market. A man who had wanted a fishing creel, tight woven to hold the wet. A family that had commissioned a cradle basket for a baby, and then moved away before the baby arrived. The basket weaver could not bring herself to finish them for someone else. because they had been begun with a specific person in mind, and finishing them for anyone else felt like a kind of betrayal. But she could not bring herself to discard them either, because each one contained hours of her work, and discarding work felt like discarding part of herself, so they accumulated. Year after year, the shelves filled. The workshop grew crowded. There was less and less room for new work, and more room for the old work that no one was coming back for. She moved between the shelves carefully, turning sideways to pass, reaching over half-finished baskets to get to her tools. The workshop that had once felt spacious and full of light now felt dense and heavy, cluttered with the ghosts of transactions that had never been completed. She told herself she was keeping them because the customers might return. But deep down, in the place where the body keeps its truths, she knew they were not coming back. The woman with the market basket had died 3 years ago. The fisherman had moved to the coast. The family with the baby would be 30 now. She was not keeping the baskets for them. She was keeping them because putting them down felt like admitting something she was not ready to admit, that the carrying had been her choice, not her obligation, that no one had asked her to hold on this long, that the weight she had been bearing was not duty or love or loyalty, but simply the habit of holding, which had become so familiar that letting go felt like falling. And that admission, the admission that the carrying had been pointless, or worse, that the carrying had been her way of avoiding the emptiness that would come when her hands were finally free, that admission was too heavy to hold and too heavy to put down, so she held everything else instead. One Sunday afternoon, her granddaughter came to visit. She was a young woman, 22, with the easy confidence of someone who has not yet learned to hold on too tightly. She walked into the workshop and looked at the shelves with wide eyes. "These are beautiful," she said, picking up a half-finished basket. The cradle, the one that had been started for a baby who was now a grown person with a life of their own. The willow had darkened with age, and the weave was tight and even, and the curve of the rim was as graceful as anything the basket weaver had ever made. "Who is it for?" the granddaughter asked. The basket weaver looked at the cradle in her granddaughter's hands. She looked at it for a long time, and then she said, very quietly, "No one anymore." The granddaughter set the basket down gently. "Then why do you keep it?" The basket weaver opened her mouth to answer and found that she did not have one. Not a real one, not one that would survive being spoken aloud. She looked around the workshop, at the shelves, the half-woven shapes, the decades of holding on, and she felt something shift, the way earth shifts before a spring rain, quietly, deep beneath the surface. "I do not know," she said. "Could you give them away?" the granddaughter asked. Not as a challenge, just as a question, the way young people ask questions that old people have forgotten to ask themselves. The basket weaver picked up the cradle. She held it in her hands. Those hands that had woven it 30 years ago, that had shaped the willow with such care, that had imagined a baby sleeping inside it. The basket was lighter than she expected. It had always been lighter than she expected. The weight had been in the keeping, not in the thing itself. "Yes," she said, "I think I could." she began that afternoon. She carried the baskets out of the workshop one by one, setting them on the table in the garden, in the late afternoon light, where the willow glowed like something alive. Her neighbor came by and took the market basket. A woman from the church took 2 small ones for her kitchen. The cradle she gave to a young mother down the street who had been looking for one. Each basket she gave away made something happen that she did not expect. She thought she would feel loss, the emptying of a shelf that had been full for decades, the absence of something she had touched every day. But what she felt instead was closer to breathing, as though the workshop itself were drawing a long, slow breath it had been holding for years. Each basket she gave away made the workshop a little lighter, not just in the physical sense, though there was that too, the way the light came back to the room as the shelves emptied and the window was no longer blocked, but in another sense, deeper and harder to name. The sense that something that had been gripped was finally being released, that the hand was opening, that the fingers, curled for so long around an obligation that no longer existed, were slowly straightening. By evening, the shelves were half empty. By the following weekend, they were almost bare, and the basket weaver stood in the middle of her workshop, in the rectangle of golden light from the window, and she looked at the space, the beautiful, breathing, open space, and she felt a lightness in her chest that she had not felt in years. She had not lost anything. She had given it back. The old texts use a word for this, vosaga. It does not mean losing. It does not mean giving up, the way we sometimes use that phrase, with defeat in it. It means releasing your grip, the way you might open your hand and let a small bird fly. The bird was never yours. Your hand was simply the place it rested for a while. And the letting go is not a loss, it is a return. The Buddha offered this quiet encouragement. If by renouncing a lesser happiness, one may realize a greater happiness, let the wise one renounce the lesser, having regard for the greater. He was not asking anyone to abandon joy. He was pointing toward a different kind of joy, the joy that does not depend on holding. The joy of the open hand, the empty shelf, the workshop full of light, the joy of the sandal maker who walks barefoot, the joy of the basket weaver standing in golden light with nothing in her hands, and everything she needs already here, already present, already enough. Tonight, lying here, you may know something about this. You may have felt, even for a moment, the particular relief of setting something down. A grudge, a worry, a plan that was never going to work the way you imagined. And in that moment of setting down, you may have noticed that nothing terrible happened. The sky did not fall. The people you love did not vanish. The world continued, quietly, gently, the way it always does, when we stop trying to hold it in place. Now, there is one more thread to follow tonight, before we move on. It begins in a workshop much simpler than the basket weavers. A workshop with a low roof and a dirt floor, and a single wooden bench, in a village where a monastery stood at the edge of the forest, and the monks walked barefoot on the paths between the trees. A sandal maker lived in this workshop. He was old enough that the monks who came to him for sandals were the grandchildren of the monks who had first come to him when he was young. He made sandals from leather and straw, simple ones, the kind that protect the soles of the feet without adding anything unnecessary. His workshop smelled of tanned leather and dried grass, and the faint incense that drifted over from the monastery when the wind came from the east. His tools were few: a curved knife, an awl, a wooden last shaped like a foot that had been worn smooth by decades of use. Sunlight came through the open doorway and fell across the bench in a warm rectangle. And in the mornings, when the monastery bell rang, the sound entered the workshop and settled into the leather and the straw and the quiet hands of the old man, as though the bell were blessing the work simply by reaching it. Over the years, his sandals had become lighter and lighter. In his youth, he had made sandals with thick soles and multiple straps, reinforced heels and decorative stitching along the edges. Sandals built to impress, built to last, built to prove that the maker was skilled. But as the decades passed, he began to strip away. First the decorative stitching went, then the extra strap, then the reinforced heel. Each pair was simpler than the last, thinner, lighter, closer, thus, to the earth, as though the sandal maker was slowly unlearning everything he had been taught about what a sandal should be, and discovering instead what a sandal needed to be, which was almost nothing at all. One morning, a young monk came to the workshop. He had just completed a long period of meditation and was about to begin a pilgrimage, a walking journey to a temple in the mountains, many days away. "I need sandals," the monk said, "strong ones, ones that will last." The sandal maker looked at the monk's feet, bare, calloused, already accustomed to the earth. He reached under his bench and pulled out a pair of sandals, so thin they were barely there. 2 pieces of leather, curved to the shape of a foot, held on by a single strip of cloth between the toes. "These will not last," the monk said, turning them over in his hands. The sandal maker smiled, a small, quiet smile, the kind that comes from having heard this objection many times. "They will last exactly as long as this walk," he said, "and then you will not need them." The monk looked at the sandals for a long time. He turned them over in his hands, feeling the thinness of the leather, the lightness of the sole, the way they bent easily, like something alive. He looked at the sandal maker, at his calm face, his unhurried hands, the way he sat on his bench with the easy stillness of a man who has made peace with impermanence. And then he looked at his own feet, and something in his face softened. The recognition that what he was afraid of was not the sandals wearing out, but arriving at the end of the journey with nothing to show for it, nothing to hold on to, nothing to prove that the walking had happened. "What do I do when they wear through?" the monk asked. "You walk on the earth," the sandal maker said. He said it simply, the way you might tell someone the time. "The earth has been holding you this whole time. Before the sandals, before the walking, before you were born. The earth was already here, already holding. The sandals were never the point. They were only there so you could learn to trust what was already beneath you." The monk was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And what about you? What do you walk on?" The sandal maker looked down at his own feet, which were bare, which had been bare for as long as anyone could remember. "I stopped making sandals for myself a long time ago," he said. "I suppose that was when I finally understood." The monk took the sandals. He slipped them on. They were lighter than anything he had ever worn, so light that he could barely feel them, as though his feet were touching the ground and not touching it at the same time, held and free in a single step. He walked out of the workshop and down the path toward the forest, and the Sandal Maker watched him go. And then he sat back down on his bench and picked up the next piece of leather, and the morning continued, quiet and unhurried, the way mornings do, in places where the work is simple and the workers have learned that not everything needs to last forever. And if something in you has softened as you listen to the Sandal Maker, if the idea of something that serves its purpose and then lets go has touched a place inside you that is tired of holding on to things that have already served theirs, then you are already understanding what Vosaga means. Not with your mind, with your body, with the part of you that is lying here tonight, in the quiet, carrying less than you were, carrying an hour ago. There is nothing more that needs doing. Let the breath come. Let the body settle. When you are ready, we will continue together. There is one more kind of carrying that we have not spoken of yet, the heaviest kind. It is the weight of believing that you do not deserve to stop. That rest is something you must earn, and that you have never quite earned enough. There is a voice that lives inside the tiredness. It is not a loud voice. It does not shout. It whispers. And what it whispers is this: not yet. You have not done enough yet. There is more to do. There is always more to do. And until the more is done, until every task is finished, every person is cared for, every loose end is tied, you have not earned the right to stop. You know this voice. You have heard it at the end of long days, when the work was done, but the feeling of being done had not arrived. You have heard it on weekends, when you sat down for a moment and then stood up again, because sitting felt like something you were getting away with. You have heard it late at night, lying in bed, running through tomorrow's list, unable to close your eyes, because closing your eyes felt like abandoning something. This voice is not cruel. It does not mean to harm you. It is the voice of someone who was taught a long time ago that rest is a reward, not a right, that stillness must be earned, that your worth is measured not by who you are, but by what you produce. Tonight, let us sit with that voice and listen to what it is really saying. And then, gently, let us listen to something else. In the basement of an old house, in a town where the winters were long and the evenings came early, there was a workshop that smelled of beeswax and burned cotton and the particular warmth of flame. Not the sharp heat of a fire, but the soft, golden warmth of candles, dozens of them, hundreds of them, lined up on wooden shelves in rows so neat. They looked like a congregation waiting quietly for something to begin. A woman worked here. She was in her early 60s, with strong hands and a wax-stained apron. She had stopped taking off at the end of the day, because the beginning and the end of the day had long ago blurred into the same thing. She made candles. Taper candles for churches, pillar candles for restaurants, votive candles for people who lit them in memory of someone they had lost, beeswax candles that smelled of honey and summer even in the darkest part of winter. She made them all, one at a time, dipping and rolling and trimming and setting them in wooden molds that were smooth from decades of use. The workshop was in the basement because the temperature was steady there, cool enough to set the wax properly, warm enough to keep it workable. The ceiling was low, crossed by dark wooden beams that had been there since the house was built, and from each beam hung bundles of wicks, sorted by thickness, thin ones for tapers, thick braided ones for the pillars, and the finest, softest cotton wicks for the votives, which needed to burn slowly and steadily, without sputtering, because the people who lit them were usually crying, and a sputtering candle felt, somehow, like an interruption to their grief. The light came from the candles themselves, and from a single bare bulb above the work table, and the air was thick with the sweet, heavy scent of melted wax that had seeped into the stone walls over the years, until the walls themselves seemed to glow faintly, even in the dark, as though the decades of warmth had been absorbed into the stone itself and were now being slowly, quietly given back. She arrived in the workshop before dawn, and she left after dark. In between, she worked. She did not take lunch breaks. She ate at the work table, a sandwich in one hand, a dipping rod in the other. She did not take days off. Sundays she cleaned the molds, organized the wicks, inventoried the wax. She did not sit down unless she was sitting down to work. The chair in her kitchen, the one with the cushion her sister had made, had a thin layer of dust on it. She could not remember the last time she had sat in it without standing up again within a minute. She was not driven by ambition. She did not dream of a bigger workshop or more customers or a candle empire. She was driven by something quieter and more persistent than ambition, the belief, held so deep it had become invisible, that stopping was dangerous, that if she stopped, something would go wrong, that the candles would not get made, that the orders would not be filled, that the people who were counting on her, and someone was always counting on her, someone was always counting on someone, would be let down. It was not the work she was afraid of losing. It was the reason for the work. Without the making, without the doing, without the constant, reliable production of something useful, who was she? What was she for? The question was too large to answer and too frightening to ask, so she did not ask it. She simply kept making candles. One evening in late November, when the dark came at 4 o'clock and the cold crept into the basement through the stone floor, the power went out. It happened suddenly. A snap of something in the distance, a hum winding down, and then silence. The bare bulb above the work table went dark. The exhaust fan stopped. The small electric heater in the corner clicked off. She stood in the sudden dark, holding a half-dipped candle in one hand and a dipping rod in the other. Around her, the workshop was full of candles, hundreds of them, on every shelf, in every corner, finished and unfinished, tall and short, white and cream, and honey-colored. She could light any one of them. She could light a dozen. She could fill the workshop with warm, golden light and keep working. Instead, she did something she had not done in a very long time. She did nothing. She set the candle down. She set the dipping rod down. She stood there, in the dark, and then she sat down, on the floor, because the floor was there, and the chair was upstairs, and her legs had made the decision before her mind could argue with it. She sat on the cool stone floor of her basement workshop, surrounded by candles she had not lit, and she breathed. The dark was not frightening. That surprised her. She had expected the dark to feel like failure, like the visual proof that she had stopped, that the workshop had gone cold, that production had ceased. But it did not feel like failure. It felt like evening, like the natural end of a day, like the moment in a garden when the sun goes down and the flowers close and the earth simply says, "That is enough for today." She sat there for 20 minutes, perhaps longer. She did not count. The cold came up through the stone and into her legs, and she did not move. Her breath slowed. Her hands, which had been shaped around tools all day, opened and rested on her knees, palms up, holding nothing. And somewhere in the quiet, somewhere between the 10th minute and the 15th, she felt something she had not felt in so many years that she had forgotten its name. She felt the absence of guilt, not happiness exactly, not joy, just the simple, startling absence of the voice that said you should be doing something. The voice was quiet. The voice, for the first time in decades, had nothing to say. And in that silence, she heard something else. Her own breathing, slow and steady, the sound of a body that was finally being allowed to simply be here. In this room, in this dark, in this life, without having to justify its presence by producing something. The power came back after an hour. The bulb flickered on. The heater clicked and hummed. The workshop returned to itself, and the candles she had made the day before were still there on the shelves, quietly, glowing in the light, as steady and present as they had been in the dark. Nothing had collapsed. Nothing had been lost. The world had continued without her effort, and it had done so gently, without reproach. The Buddha once observed that contentment is the greatest wealth, not achievement, not accumulation, not the satisfaction of having produced more than the person beside you. Contentment, the quiet recognition that what you have, what you are, this moment, is sufficient, that the candles already made are enough candles, that the work already done is enough work, that you, sitting here in the dark with your palms turned upward, are enough. Now there is a story from the mountains of Japan that speaks to this teaching in a way that no scripture quite can. It speaks through silence, which is often the most honest language there is. In a mountain village where the pine forests grew thick and dark, and the winters brought snow that muffled every sound, until the world felt padded and still, there lived a woman who made ink. She had learned the craft from her mother, and her mother had learned it from hers. 3 generations of women who collected pine soot from the underside of clay lids placed over burning resin, who mixed the soot with animal glue and camphor and kneaded it into sticks that were dense and black and smelled of forest and smoke. The ink making was slow work. The soot had to be collected flake by flake, each flake so fine it could be scattered by a breath. The kneading took hours, sometimes days. The mixture worked and reworked until it was smooth and uniform, without a single grain of grit. Her hands were permanently stained, the fingertips black, the lines of her palms traced in dark ink, as though her own body had been slowly written upon by the work she had done. She was good at what she did. The calligraphers who used her ink said it was the finest they had ever known. It flowed without catching, dried without fading, held the brush stroke exactly as the hand intended. She took pride in this, but the pride was complicated, because the pride was also the whip. The better the ink, the more people wanted. The more people wanted, the more she worked. The more she worked, the less she slept, the less she ate, the less she sat in the small garden behind her workshop, where the moss grew thick between the stones, and the light in the late afternoon turned everything the color of green tea. She could not remember the last time she had sat in that garden without feeling that she should be inside, working. One autumn morning, after a night of poor sleep, she put on her warmest jacket and walked 3 hours up the mountain to the hermitage, where an old Zen nun lived alone. The hermitage was simple: a single room, a charcoal brazier, a window that looked out over the valley. The nun was very old, with a face as creased and brown as a walnut, and she moved with the slowness of someone who has arrived at a pace that cannot be hurried, not because the body is weak, but because the mind has finally agreed that there is nowhere it needs to be. The ink maker knelt on the floor and poured tea for both of them, a ritual she had learned as a girl. The careful movements, the precise angles, the silence that is not absence but attention. The nun accepted the tea with both hands and drank it slowly. "I have a question," the ink maker said. The nun looked at her, not with curiosity, with the kind of patience that comes from having heard many questions and knowing that most of them contain their own answer. "When will I have done enough to deserve rest?" the ink maker asked. The nun said nothing. She drank her tea. She set the cup down with a small, precise sound, ceramic on wood. She looked out the window at the valley, where the maples were turning red and the mist was rising from the river in thin white threads. She sat very still, and then gently, slowly, with the ease of a leaf settling on water, she closed her eyes and she fell asleep. The ink maker waited. She waited for 10 minutes, then 20. The nun's breathing deepened. Her hands relaxed in her lap. The brazier crackled softly. Outside, a crow called once and then was quiet. The afternoon light moved across the floor and climbed the far wall, and the shadows of the pine branches swayed gently, like brushstrokes, being painted and erased and painted again. The ink maker sat in the quiet room with the sleeping nun, and she felt something she could not name. Something that was not irritation and not confusion and not impatience, but something closer to recognition. As though she were looking at something she had been searching for. And it was so simple, so unadorned, so completely ordinary, that she had walked past it 1,000 times without seeing it. When the nun woke, after perhaps 30 minutes, perhaps an hour, the ink maker was still sitting there, still kneeling, still waiting. "You fell asleep," the ink maker said. "I was waiting for your answer." The nun looked at her with clear, unhurried eyes. "That was my answer," she said. The ink maker did not speak. She did not need to. The answer was not in words. It was in the falling asleep itself. The complete unself-conscious surrender to the body's need. No justification, no apology, no earning. The nun had not done enough to deserve rest. She had not done anything at all. She had simply been tired, and so she had slept. And in that sleeping, she had taught the ink maker everything she needed to know. Rest is not a reward for finishing. Rest is not what happens after the work is done. Rest is its own work. Rest is the body's quiet declaration that it is here, and that being here, just being here, without producing, without justifying, without earning, is sufficient. The ink maker walked back down the mountain that afternoon. The 3-hour walk felt shorter than it had that morning, though the path was the same, and her legs were no less tired. When she arrived home, she did not go into the workshop. She went into the garden. She sat on the stone bench between the moss and the ferns, and she watched the light change, and she did not feel guilty. That was new. That was everything. In the traditions of the Navajo people, there is a way of understanding the world that does not separate rest from purpose. An old grandmother, sitting with her grandchild beneath a cottonwood tree in the red desert, the shadows long and cool across the sand, told the child something very simple. The earth rests every winter, she said. The fields rest, the rivers slow down, the bears sleep. The seeds stop growing and wait in the dark. The child listened the way children listen, completely, without judgment, with the body as much as the ears. The cottonwood leaves turned in the breeze above them, flashing silver and green, and the shadows they cast moved across the sand like small, quiet animals going nowhere in particular. "Do you think the earth is lazy?" the grandmother asked. The child shook her head. "Do you think the bear is weak because it sleeps?" The child shook her head again. "Then why?" the grandmother said, putting her hand on the child's knee. "Do you think you must keep running?" The child did not answer, but her body answered. Her shoulders dropped, her breathing slowed, and she leaned against her grandmother's side, the way a small tree leans toward the sun, naturally, without deciding to. That is what rest looks like when it has not been taught out of you. It looks like leaning. It looks like letting something else hold you up. It looks like the most natural thing in the world, because it is. The grandmother did not say anything more. She did not need to. She simply put her arm around the child, and they sat together under the cottonwood tree, while the desert evening came on slowly, turning the red rock to copper, and then to violet, and the first stars appeared in the wide, clear sky like small, bright permissions. Bodhidharma, the old Zen teacher, who carried the teaching from India to China and sat facing a wall for 9 years, said something that sounds, at first, like nothing at all. He said, "Not thinking about anything is Zen. Once you know this, walking, sitting, or lying down, everything you do is Zen. Not thinking about anything, not producing anything, not earning anything, just this, just here, just the breath moving in and out, and the body lying still, and the mind, for once, for this one moment, not reaching for the next thing." The old language has a word for what happens when the reaching stops. It is passaddhi, tranquility. But the word means something more specific than tranquility. It means the calming that comes after effort, the settling that follows exertion. Not the absence of energy, but the natural completion of it. The way a river becomes still not because it stops flowing, but because it has reached a wide, open place where the current spreads out and slows down, and the surface becomes smooth enough to reflect the sky. Perhaps you are in that wide place now. Perhaps the stories have carried you here without you noticing, the way a river carries a leaf, not by force, but by flow. And if the body has grown heavier against the bed, if the eyes are softer than they were, if the breath has found a rhythm that you did not choose, but that feels, somehow, Exactly right. Then you are already doing what the nun did in her mountain hermitage. You are already doing what the bear does in winter, earth does in December, and the fields do when the harvest is done. You are resting. And the resting is not something you need to earn. It is something you are. Let us be here for a moment. Let the quiet settle. When you are ready, we will continue together. And here the teaching turns towards something even quieter than rest, toward the wisdom that lives in doing absolutely nothing at all, not as absence, not as failure, but as the deepest, most courageous act a tired person can perform. There is a kind of doing that looks like nothing. It has no product. It has no proof. If someone were to walk into the room and ask, "What have you accomplished?" you would have nothing to show them. No object, no result, no evidence that the hours had been spent on anything at all. And yet this doing, this quiet, invisible, unhurried doing of nothing, may be the most important work a tired person ever learns. The world does not teach this. The world teaches the opposite, that every hour must be accounted for, that stillness is waste, that a person sitting quietly in a chair with nothing in their hands is a person who has somehow failed. But tonight, let us sit with 3 people who discovered something different, who found in the heart of doing nothing a wisdom so deep it could only be reached by stopping. On the bank of a canal, in a city built on water, where the bridges arched over the dark, slow current, like stone arms, reaching from one side to the other, there lived a woman whose job was to tend a bridge. It was not a famous bridge. It was not beautiful in the way that the great bridges of the city were beautiful. No carved lions, no iron lanterns, no marble railings worn smooth by centuries of hands. It was a small wooden drawbridge at the edge of the old quarter, where the canal narrowed between 2 warehouses, and the water moved so slowly that you could watch a fallen leaf travel the length of the bridge's shadow without ever seeming to move at all. Her job was simple. When a boat approached, a barge carrying grain, a fisherman's skiff, occasionally a pleasure boat with lanterns strung along the gunwales, she turned the crank that lifted the bridge, waited for the boat to pass, and lowered it again. That was all. Between the boats she waited. And the boats did not come often. In the morning, perhaps 3 or 4. In the afternoon, 1 or 2. In the evenings, sometimes none at all. She had a small wooden booth beside the crank mechanism, with a chair and a shelf, where she kept a thermos of coffee and a tin of biscuits and a book she rarely read, because the light inside the booth was poor and her eyes were not what they had been. The booth had a window that looked out over the canal, and through this window she watched the water, the birds, the slow drift of clouds reflected in the surface, the way the light changed from morning silver to afternoon gold to the deep, bruised violet of evening. She had been tending this bridge for 22 years. Before that, she had worked in a factory that made buttons, small, white, mother-of-pearl buttons that were punched from shells, imported from the Pacific. The factory was loud and fast, and the air smelled of ground shell and machine oil, and every day was measured in output. How many buttons per hour? How many per shift? How many flawed ones discarded into the bin beneath her station? She had been good at it. Her hands were quick. Her count was high. But the noise had gotten into her somehow. Not just into her ears, but into her nervous system, into the rhythm of her thoughts. Until even in the quiet of her apartment at night, she could hear the punching machines, the steady, relentless percussion of shell becoming button, becoming product, becoming proof that the day had not been wasted. When the factory closed, when the machines were sold, and the building was converted into apartments for people who had never heard of mother-of-pearl buttons, she had expected to feel lost. Instead, she felt something she did not have a word for. She felt the noise stop. Not gradually, the way a machine winds down, but all at once, like a door closing on a loud room. And in the silence that followed, she heard, for the first time in decades, the sound of her own breathing. The bridge tending job came to her through a cousin who worked for the city. It paid very little. It required almost nothing. Her friends told her it was a waste of her skills. Her sister said she would go mad with boredom. Her former supervisor at the factory, whom she met by chance at the market, looked at her with a kind of pity and said, "But what do you do all day?" She had tried to answer that question honestly. She had tried to explain that she watched the water, that she listened to the birds, the coots that nested under the bridge, the herons that stood in the shallows, on the far side of the canal like grey, patient monks waiting for something only they could see. That she noticed the way the light moved across the surface of the water in the late afternoon, breaking into small, bright pieces that looked like scattered coins. That she sat in her booth and drank coffee and felt the particular piece of a person who has nowhere to be and nothing to prove. But the words sounded thin when she said them aloud. They sounded like excuses. They sounded like the explanation of someone who had given up. She had not given up. She had arrived. But arriving looks so much like stopping that the world cannot tell the difference. 22 years she sat beside that bridge. 22 years of watching the water and lifting the crank and lowering it again and sitting back down in her chair where the cushion had taken the shape of her body and the armrests were worn smooth by her hands. And in those 22 years, something happened to her that she could not have predicted and did not fully understand until much later. She became quiet. Not just outwardly quiet, the way a person is quiet when there is no one to talk to. Quiet inside. The noise of the factory, which had lived in her nervous system for so long, faded. The compulsion to count, to measure, to prove, it softened. The way sharp edges soften in water, slowly, without anyone deciding it should happen. She did not meditate. She did not practice any discipline. She simply sat, day after day, beside a small bridge over a slow canal, and let the doing of nothing do its work. And the work it did was this. It taught her that she was not what she produced, that her worth was not measured in buttons per hour, or boats per day, or any other unit the world had invented to turn a life into a ledger. She was simply a woman sitting beside water, watching light move, breathing in and breathing out, and just the sitting and the watching and the breathing, was a complete life, not a partial one, not a life waiting to be filled. A life that was already full, in the way that a glass of water is full, not because anything has been added to it, but because it holds exactly what it needs. One evening, late in autumn, when the canal was perfectly still, and the first stars were reflected in the water so clearly that it looked as though the sky had sunk to the bottom, a young city official came to inspect the bridge mechanism. He was brisk, efficient, carrying a clipboard and a flashlight, and the particular impatience of someone who has too many bridges to inspect before the end of the day. He checked the crank, he checked the hinges, he made notes on his clipboard, and then he turned to her and said, almost as an afterthought, "It must be very boring, this job." She looked at the canal. The stars floated on the water. A coot called softly from beneath the bridge, a small, liquid sound that seemed to come from the water itself. It was, she said, for the first year, perhaps the second, and then the boredom became something else. What did it become? She thought about this for a moment. Attention, she said. It became attention, preserved for more than 2,000 years. The official looked at her with the expression of someone who has heard something he does not yet understand, but suspects he will remember later. He closed his clipboard. He thanked her. And he walked away across the bridge, his footsteps hollow on the wooden planks, growing quieter and quieter, until the only sound was the water moving slowly beneath the bridge, carrying the reflections of the stars downstream. The Buddha once made an observation so simple, it is easy to miss. He said, "Those who are awake do not sleep. Those who are calm are not restless." And the wise, seeing into this, freed from disturbance, are truly at peace. He was not describing effort. He was describing what remains when effort stops. The calm that is already there, beneath the noise, the way the bottom of a river is always still, no matter how fast the current moves above it. Now, in a city on the water far from the bridge keeper's canal, a city of islands and glass and furnaces that had been burning for 700 years, there lived a man who made glass, not ordinary glass. The kind of glass that seems to hold light inside it, as though the fire that shaped it had never quite gone out. He worked on an island where the glassmakers had been moved centuries ago, because the furnaces kept setting the mainland on fire, and the city fathers had decided it was better to let the glassmakers burn on their own island than to risk the whole city. The furnace in his workshop ran day and night. It was never allowed to go out, not in winter, not in summer, not during the festivals, when the rest of the island closed its doors and the streets filled with music. The fire had been continuous for so long that the bricks of the furnace had fused together, and the floor around it was warm to the touch, even in January, and the air inside the workshop was always thick and shimmering, the way air shimmers above a road in summer. He was 73 years old, and he had been working with glass since he was 12. His hands were covered in small, white scars, the marks of a lifetime of tiny burns, each one a moment when the molten glass had touched skin and left its signature. He did not flinch anymore when it happened. His hands had learned to accept the burning in the way a farmer's hands accept the soil, as part of the work, as part of the conversation between the maker and the made. His specialty was blown glass, the kind where you gather a ball of molten glass on the end of a long iron pipe and blow into it, shaping it with your breath and your hands, and the turning of the pipe, coaxing the glass into forms that seem impossible for something so fragile. Vases thin as paper, bowls that caught the light and threw it across the room in colors that had no names, goblets so delicate that they seemed to be made not of glass but of frozen air. But the thing he was most famous for, the thing that collectors traveled from distant countries to see, was something he called il riposo, the rest. It was not a vase or a bowl or a goblet. It was a sphere, a perfect clear sphere of glass, no larger than a man's fist, with nothing inside it. No color, no pattern, no decoration. Just clarity. The kind of clarity that makes you feel as though you are looking not at something, but through something, into a space that is somehow larger on the inside than the outside. He made one a year, only one. And the making of it took 3 days. 3 days of heating and blowing and cooling and reheating, adjusting the temperature by fractions of a degree, turning the pipe so slowly that his arms ached with the effort of not hurrying. The secret, he told his apprentices, was not in the blowing. It was in the pausing. You must learn to do nothing at the right moment, he said. The glass tells you when it becomes still. The surface stops moving. And in that moment of perfect stillness, you do nothing. You do not blow. You do not turn. You do not shape. You simply hold the pipe and let the glass decide what it wants to become. The apprentices found this maddening. They wanted to do something. They wanted to shape, to control, to impose their will on the material. They understood effort. What they did not understand was the effort of not making effort. The discipline of standing beside a furnace with a ball of molten glass on the end of a pipe and doing absolutely nothing. The glass knows, the old man said, watching a young apprentice struggle with a sphere that kept losing its shape. But it cannot hear itself over the sound of your trying. One afternoon, after many failed attempts, the youngest apprentice, a woman with steady hands, and the quiet patience of someone who had grown up beside the water, stood at the furnace with a gather of molten glass on her pipe. She had been blowing and turning for an hour, and the glass was close. Almost spherical, almost clear, almost there. And then it happened. The moment of stillness. The surface stopped rippling. The glass hung on the pipe like a drop of liquid light, perfectly round, perfectly calm. She froze. Every instinct told her to do something, to adjust, to correct, to make one final turn of the pipe. But she remembered what the old man had said. She remembered the word he used, riposo, and she did nothing. She stood there, holding the pipe, breathing slowly, letting the glass be what it was. The furnace hummed. The heat shimmered, and the glass cooled, fraction by fraction, holding its shape not because she had forced it, but because she had allowed it. When she lifted the finished sphere from the pipe, the old man looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he said quietly, "Now you understand. The most important thing you will ever learn in this workshop is when to stop working." He set the sphere on the windowsill, where the afternoon light came through it, and cast a small, perfect circle of brightness on the far wall, a circle that moved as the sun moved, slowly, unhurried, the way all the truest things in the world move. The sixth patriarch of Zen, a man named Huineng, who was said to have been illiterate, and who achieved his understanding not through study, but through the direct experience of his own mind, once said something that has puzzled and comforted people for 1300 years. He said, from the first, not a thing is. He did not mean that nothing exists. He meant that the things we build and hold and carry and produce are not the foundation. The foundation is what was there before the building began. The stillness beneath the effort, the silence beneath the sound, the nothing that holds everything the way the sky holds clouds. Not by grasping, by being wide enough to let them pass. And here, one more story settles in, not from a canal or a furnace, but from a cave. It is the story of a man who did nothing for 9 years, and in doing nothing, changed the course of an entire tradition. Bodhidharma was an Indian monk who traveled to China in the 5th century, carrying the teaching of meditation across mountains and deserts and seas. When he arrived, the emperor, a man who had built temples and funded monasteries and donated vast sums to the Buddhist order, asked him a question that emperors ask: "What merit have I earned for all this generosity?" Bodhidharma looked at the emperor with clear, unhurried eyes and said, "No merit whatsoever." The emperor was not pleased. Merit was the currency of his faith. You did good things, and good things came back to you. That was the arrangement. That was the deal. And here was this dusty monk from India, telling him that the deal was not real. Bodhidharma left the emperor's court and walked to a monastery on a mountain called Shaolin. And there, in a small cave carved into the rock face, he sat down facing the wall. He sat there for 9 years. 9 years of facing stone. 9 years of doing nothing, no teaching, no writing, no building, no producing, just sitting, just breathing, just the quiet, radical act of a man who believed that the deepest truth could not be reached by doing more, but only by doing less. And then less than that. And then nothing at all. The legend says that his legs withered, that his shadow was burned into the cave wall by the force of his concentration. These are legends. They belong to the realm of story, not history. But what is not legend is what happened after. The tradition that grew from that cave, the tradition of sitting quietly, of facing the wall, of finding in stillness what cannot be found in motion, became one of the most enduring contemplative practices the world has ever known. And it began with a man who did nothing, who sat in a cave and let the silence speak. The old teachings have a word for the courage it takes to stop. It is nekkhamma, and it does not mean laziness or withdrawal or defeat. It means the willing renunciation of busyness, the conscious, deliberate decision to step out of the current of doing and stand on the bank and watch the water pass. Not because the current is dangerous, but because standing on the bank is where you finally see clearly where the river is going, where it has been, and that you were never required to swim against it. The Buddha, in one of his gentlest teachings, said this: secluded, content with passion stilled, one is radiant, not busy, not productive, not accomplished, radiant, glowing from within, the way the glassmaker's sphere, La, glows when the light passes through it, not because anything has been added, but because nothing is in the way. Perhaps you are glowing now, not dramatically, not visibly, but somewhere inside, in the place where the tiredness lives, a small light has been growing steadier with each story, each breath, each moment of lying here without needing to do anything at all. That light is not something you created. It is something that was always there, waiting for the doing to stop so it could finally be seen. Let us be here for a moment. Let the quiet settle around you, the way water settles around a stone, not by force, but by patience. When you are ready, we will continue together. And here the teaching turns one final time, towards something so light you may not notice it arriving, toward the feeling of a body that has finally set everything down, toward what it feels like after all the carrying and the holding and the gripping and the rowing, to simply be here, unburdened, unweighted, lighter than you have been in years. There is a feeling that comes after the carrying stops. It does not arrive with fanfare. It does not announce itself. It comes the way morning comes, slowly, in layers of light so gradual that you cannot say exactly when the dark ended and the day began. You only know that at some point, without deciding to, you opened your eyes, and the world was brighter than it had been. Tonight, we will follow two women whose stories move alongside each other, like two rivers running through the same valley. They do not seem connected. At first they will be. The first woman lived in a mountain town where the winters were long and the wool was thick, and the looms clattered from September to April in every other house on the main street. She was a weaver, not of tapestries or fine cloth. She wove blankets, heavy, warm blankets made from the wool of sheep that grazed on the slopes above the town, where the grass was short and tough, and the wind kept the fleece dense and oily, perfect for keeping out the cold. Her loom was old. It had been her grandmother's, and before that, her great-grandmother's. The frame was dark walnut, scarred and smoothed by generations of hands, and the heddles made a sound, when they lifted, that she could recognize from 3 rooms away. A soft, rhythmic clicking, like the heartbeat of something large and patient. She had learned to weave as a girl of 9, standing beside her grandmother on a wooden stool so she could reach the breastbeam, her small hands following her grandmother's large ones, learning the pattern the way children learn songs, by repetition, by feel, by the body memorizing what the mind cannot yet hold. The workshop where she worked was on the ground floor of her house, with a window that faced the street. Passers-by could hear the loom, that clicking, that rhythm, steady as rain on a roof, and they knew, without looking, that she was inside, working the way she was always inside, always working. The room smelled of lanolin and wood, and the particular dusty sweetness of raw wool, a scent so familiar to her that she only noticed it when she had been away, which was almost never. She wove heavy blankets. That was her reputation, her identity, the thing the town knew her for. The blankets she made were so dense that a single one could weigh as much as a small child. People said her blankets could keep you warm in a snowstorm, could stop the wind, could turn a cold house into a warm one by their presence alone. She was proud of this. She wove tightly, packed the weft firmly with the beater, used the thickest yarn. Each blanket took weeks. Each one was heavy in the hands, heavy on the bed, heavy to fold and store and carry. She did not think about the heaviness. It was the point. Heavy meant warm. Heavy meant protection. Heavy meant that the person sleeping beneath it was safe from the cold, held down by wool and care, covered completely. But here let us leave her for a moment, at her loom in the mountain town, and travel to a different place entirely. In a river valley far to the south, where the water ran clear and cold over flat stones, and the willows trailed their branches in the current, like long green fingers combing the water, there was a laundress. She was old enough that her hair had gone completely white, and her face was lined in the particular way that faces line when they have spent decades smiling into bright light. She knelt on a flat stone at the edge of the river each morning, washing clothes the way her mother had washed them, by hand in the current, pressing the fabric against the stone and letting the water do the work. The stone she knelt on had been worn into a shallow bowl by years of knees, hers and before hers. Others who had found this same spot where the current was strong enough to rinse but gentle enough not to pull the cloth from your hands. The morning light on the water was the color of pale tea, and the sound the river made as it passed over the stones was a sound she knew better than music, low, continuous, like the breathing of something very large and very calm. The clothes she washed were not her own. They belonged to a family in the village, a young couple with 3 small children, and more laundry than any 2 people could manage alongside the rest of their lives. The laundress came 3 mornings a week, collected the basket from the porch, carried it down the path to the river, and washed everything by hand. She could have used the machine in the family's kitchen. They had offered more than once, but she preferred the river. She preferred the feel of the water running through her fingers and through the cloth, carrying the dirt downstream, carrying the sweat and the stains, and the evidence of living away, gently, the way rivers carry everything, without judgment, without hurry, without any interest in where the dirt had come from or what it meant. Her hands moved through the water with a slowness that was not inefficiency, but mastery. Each garment was held to the current, pressed, turned, pressed again. A child's shirt, a pair of small trousers with grass stains on the knees. A woman's dress, light cotton, faded from many washings, but still holding its shape. The laundress handled each one with the same unhurried attention, as though each piece of clothing were a small life that had been entrusted to her care. When she was finished, she spread the clothes on the flat stones along the riverbank to dry. They lay there in the sun like bright, empty versions of the people who wore them. A shirt with its arms spread wide, a dress with its skirt fanned out, a row of small socks lined up like the footprints of children who had run ahead and disappeared around a bend. And she sat on her stone and watched the water move and felt the sun on her face and her wet hands resting in her lap. And she felt, without thinking the word, without naming it, light. Not light as in brightness, light as in weight, light as in the absence of heaviness, light as in the particular freedom of a body that is not gripping, not carrying, not holding anything at all. Her hands were empty, her lap was empty, the basket was empty, and the emptiness was not loss, it was space, it was room, it was the feeling of a breath that goes all the way down, filling the lungs completely, because there is nothing pressing against them. Now, let us return to the mountain town, to the weaver at her loom. Something is changing. It happens slowly, the way all the important changes happen. So gradually that she did not notice until one day she looked at the blanket on her loom and realized It was not the same kind of blanket she had always made. It was thinner. The weft was looser. The yarn was finer. She had not decided to change. Her hands had decided for her. Hands, the way hands sometimes do, when they know something the mind has not yet admitted. She tried to go back to the heavy blankets. She packed the weft tighter. She chose thicker yarn. But her hands resisted, not dramatically, not painfully, just with a quiet reluctance, the way a body resists walking back to a place it has already left. And one afternoon, she stopped fighting. She let her hands weave what they wanted to weave. And what they wove was something she had never made before. A blanket so light it could be folded into a square no bigger than a book, so thin that you could see light through it, so soft that it felt less like wool and more like being held by something made of air. She looked at it on the loom and felt a confusion that was close to grief. She touched the fabric with her fingertips, and it moved under her hand like water, like breath, like something that was barely there at all. The light from the window passed through it and cast a faint golden shadow on the floor. Not the hard, dark shadow of her heavy blankets, but a soft glow, as though the blanket were not blocking the light, but translating it into something warmer. This was not what she was known for. This was not what people wanted. People wanted the heavy blankets, the ones that pinned you to the bed, the ones that kept the cold out by sheer force of weight. This light thing, this gossamer, this almost nothing. What good was it? She finished it anyway. She cut it from the loom and folded it and set it on the shelf beside the heavy blankets, where it looked small and insubstantial, like a whisper beside a shout. And then a woman came into the shop, an old woman, walking slowly, with the careful steps of someone whose bones had grown tired of carrying the weight of a body. She looked at the heavy blankets on the shelf. She touched them with one hand, and then her eyes found the light one, the thin, folded square that barely looked like a blanket at all. "What is this?" she asked. "I am not sure," the weaver said. "Something my hands made while my mind was not paying attention." The old woman unfolded it. She held it up to the window, and the afternoon light came through it, soft and golden, and the wool glowed the way clouds glow when the sun is behind them. "It is warm," the old woman said, surprised. She had draped it over her shoulders, and despite its lightness, despite its thinness, the warmth was there. Not the crushing warmth of the heavy blankets, but a warmth that felt like being remembered, like being held by someone who did not need to squeeze to prove they were there. "How much?" the old woman asked. The weaver named a price, less than her heavy blankets, because it weighed less, because it had taken less yarn, because she did not yet understand that what she had made was not less but different. The old woman paid and left, and the weaver stood in her shop feeling something she could not name, a lightness in her own chest that matched the lightness of the blanket, as though in making it she had woven something out of herself as well. And here is where the two rivers meet. The old woman who bought the blanket walked home through the village, the thin wool folded over her arm. She walked down the main street, past the bakery, past the church, past the stone fountain in the square, where pigeons gathered in the afternoon. She walked down a narrow lane that led to the river, where the willows grew and the flat stones lay along the bank. And she walked to the stone, where 3 mornings a week she knelt and washed clothes in the current. She was the laundress. And the weaver, the young woman at the loom in the mountain town, whose hands had changed without her permission, who had woven something light after a lifetime of making heavy things, was also her, decades earlier, before the river, before the lightness, before her hands had learned what her mind would take years to understand. They were the same woman, the same hands that had woven wool so heavy it could stop the wind now washed cotton, so thin the light passed through it. The same heart that had believed warmth meant weight now understood that warmth could mean almost nothing at all, just presence, just care, just the quiet act of showing up at the river 3 mornings a week and letting the water carry the dirt away. The heavy blankets had come first, when the world felt like something that needed to be kept out, when warmth meant weight, when safety meant being held down, when love meant covering someone so completely that the cold could not possibly reach them. And the light blanket had come later, years later, after the children had grown and left, after the shop had grown quiet, after the mountain winters had turned her hair white and her hands thin and her heart into something softer and less defended than the heart she had carried as a young woman. It had come when she began to learn, without knowing she was learning, that warmth does not require weight, that holding does not require gripping, that a thin, almost transparent thing, woven with care and held up to the light, can keep a person warm in a way that the heaviest blanket never could. And now she was old, kneeling beside a river in a valley far from the mountain town, where the looms still clattered behind closed shutters. Her hands, which had once packed the weft so tightly that the blankets could stop the wind, now moved through the water with the gentleness of someone who has finally understood that gentleness is not weakness. It is what strength becomes when it no longer needs to prove itself. Her hands were empty most of the time, and the emptiness was not frightening. It was the lightest thing she had ever carried, lighter than the thinnest blanket she had ever woven, lighter than the water running through her fingers, lighter than the morning light on the river, which weighed nothing at all, and yet held everything it touched in gold. There is a passage in the old teachings, from a text called the Udana, which contains some of the Buddha's most spontaneous utterances, the things he said, not in formal teaching, but in moments of quiet joy, that speaks to this lightness. He said, "There is that sphere where there is neither earth, nor water, nor fire, nor wind. It is not this world or another world. It is not the sun or the moon. I do not call it coming or going, or standing still, or falling away. It is without foundation, without continuation, without stopping. It is just this, the end of suffering." He was not describing a place. He was describing a feeling, the feeling of a body that has stopped bracing, the feeling of hands that are not gripping, the feeling of a mind that has stopped reaching for the next thing, and found, in the not reaching, a spaciousness so complete that it does not need a name. And here, one final image settles in, not a story, but something quieter than a story, something seen. High above the valley, where the laundress knelt beside the river, a bird was flying south. It was autumn, and the bird was one of thousands, A great, loose flock moving across the sky in a pattern that shifted and flowed like water. Each bird adjusting to the birds around it without signal or instruction. The whole flock breathing together like a single creature with 10,000 wings. This bird, this one particular bird in the vast moving cloud of birds, had been flying for days. It had crossed mountains and rivers and plains and the long, empty stretches of sea where there was nothing below but water and nothing above but sky. Its wings ached. Its feathers were worn from weeks of wind. Its body was light with hunger, and yet it kept flying, not because it was strong, but because the air kept holding it. The thermals rose from the warm earth and lifted the bird without effort, the way a river lifts a leaf, the way a breath lifts a feather, the way the quiet of this evening is lifting you now, gently, without force, without asking anything in return. From the ground, the flock looked like smoke, dark, shifting, beautiful in the way that only unplanned things are beautiful. From inside, the bird felt nothing but belonging. It did not know the word for flock. It only knew the warmth of the bird beside it, the rhythm of wings matching wings, the shared turning that happened without discussion or decision, the way a river turns when the land turns, naturally, without resistance. The bird did not know where it was going. It followed the flock, and the flock followed the warmth, and the warmth followed the turning of the earth, and the earth turned because that is what the earth does. It turns, and in turning, it carries everything, and the carrying is not a burden. It is what the earth is for. The old poet Ryokan, who lived alone in his mountain hut and swept the path each morning, even though no one was coming, wrote this: "Keep your heart clear and bright as the autumn moon, and everything else will follow." He did not say what would follow. He did not need to. The heart already knows. It has been waiting through all the carrying, all the holding, all the stories, all the quiet evenings, for this moment, for the permission to be clear, for the permission to be bright, for the permission to be light. The old teachings call this lahuta. It means lightness, but not the lightness of something that has been emptied. The lightness of something that has been freed. The way a bird is light, not because it is small, but because it was made to fly. The way your body feels light now. If it does, if the heaviness has lifted even slightly, if the breath comes easier than it did an hour ago. Not because anything has been taken away, but because something has been returned. The lightness was always yours. You were simply carrying too much to feel it. Let the breath come slowly now. Let the body settle. There is nothing more that needs doing. Nothing more that needs carrying. Nothing more that needs to be understood or held or solved or kept. When you are ready, we will come to the final resting place together. The place where the stories end and the quiet begins. And the quiet is not empty, but full, full of everything you have heard tonight, settling gently into the place where sleep lives. And now the stories have carried you here, to this quiet place, this still place, this place at the edge of sleep, where the words grow softer, and the breathing grows slower, and the body has begun to do what it has wanted to do all evening, which is simply to rest. There is one last story. It is not a long one. It does not need to be. The longest journeys often end with the smallest steps, and this story is a small step, just a woman in a field, At the end of a day, doing something so ordinary that you might miss it if you were not paying attention. But you are paying attention. You have been paying attention all evening in the way that matters most. Not with the mind which tries to hold everything, but with the body which knows how to let things settle. In a valley where the mountains rose on both sides like cupped hands, there was a rice paddy that had been planted by the same family for 6 generations. The water came from a stream that ran down from the snowfields above, cold and clear, and it filled the paddy in spring until the field became a mirror, reflecting the sky, reflecting the mountains, reflecting the clouds that moved so slowly overhead, that watching them felt like watching time itself pass at the pace it was always meant to move. A woman tended this field. She was in her 70s, small and strong, in the way that people who work with the earth are strong, not with the bulk of effort, but with the density of patience. Her back was curved from decades of bending. Her hands were the color of the soil she worked in, and her feet, bare in the warm months, knew the bottom of the paddy, the way a hand knows the inside of a glove. Every stone, every dip, every place where the mud was deep and where it was firm. In winter, when the field was fallow and the snow covered the mountains, and the stream ran thin and quiet beneath a shelf of ice, she rested. She sat beside the hearth in her small house, drinking tea from a cup so old the glaze had worn away where her thumb rested, and she watched the snow fall through the window, each flake arriving without urgency, settling without sound, covering the field in a silence so complete it felt like the earth was holding its breath. She did not plan, she did not worry about the spring. The spring would come because the spring always came, and the field would be ready because the field was always ready, and her hands would remember what to do because her hands had never forgotten. She planted the rice in spring. This was the hardest work, standing in water up to her calves, bending at the waist, pushing each seedling into the mud with her fingers, one by one, row after row, until the paddy was filled with small green shoots standing upright in the still water like a congregation of tiny, hopeful things. Her back ached, her legs ached. The sun moved across the sky, and her shadow moved with it, stretching and shortening, stretching and shortening, as though her body were breathing along with the day. She tended the rice through summer. She watched it grow the way a grandmother watches a grandchild, with patience, with knowledge, with the particular tenderness of someone who has seen this miracle before and is still moved by it. The green deepened, the stalks thickened, the paddy hummed with insects and the small, clear songs of frogs that lived in the warm water between the rows. She adjusted the water levels, a little more when the heat was fierce and the sun baked the edges of the paddy into cracked clay, a little less when the rains came, and the stream swelled and the mountains disappeared behind curtains of grey water that fell so steadily. It sounded like the earth itself was exhaling. She walked the edges of the paddy each morning, checking for pests, for disease, for the small signs that only a lifetime of watching could teach her to see. She knew each section of the field the way a mother knows her children, not by counting, but by feel. She could tell when the rice was thirsty. She could tell when it was ready. And then, in autumn, when the rice turned from green to gold. A gold so deep and warm that the whole paddy seemed to glow in the late afternoon light, as though the months of sun and water and patient tending had been distilled into color. She harvested. She rose before dawn on the first day of cutting, when the air was cool and the dew still lay on the stalks like small, bright beads that trembled when the wind touched them. She took her sickle, a curved blade with a wooden handle worn smooth by her palm and her mother's palm and her grandmother's palm before that. The blade sharpened so many times over the decades that it was thin as a leaf, thin as paper, thin as the last light before dark. She bent to the first row. The sickle whispered through the stalks. The rice fell into her other hand in a clean bundle, and she tied it with a twist of straw and set it on the ground. Then the next row, and the next. She moved through the paddy slowly, rhythmically, the way the breath moves. Cut and gather, and behind her, the standing rice grew shorter and the bundles grew taller, and the field opened up, section by section, returning to the water and mud and sky it had been before the planting. She hung the bundles upside down on wooden racks to dry, long rows of golden sheaves hanging in the autumn sun, swaying gently when the breeze came through, rustling with a sound like whispered conversation. The drying took weeks. The field, which had been green, and then golden, and then full of the particular beauty of something at its peak, became empty. This was the part that most people did not see. The planting was celebrated, the harvest was celebrated. But the emptying, the quiet moment when the last bundle was cut, and the field returned to mud and water and sky, that moment belonged only to her. She stood at the edge of the empty paddy in the late afternoon light, with her sickle in one hand and her other hand resting on her hip, and she looked at the field she had filled and then emptied, and she felt the particular peace of completion, not accomplishment, completion. There is a difference. Accomplishment asks, what did I achieve? Completion simply says, it is done. The planting is done. The tending is done. The harvest is done. And now the field can rest. She understood something about rest that the world had mostly forgotten. She understood that rest is not what happens when you have nothing to do. Rest is what happens when the doing is complete, when the cycle has turned all the way around and arrived back at stillness, the way a wheel arrives back at the place it started, not because it has failed, but because that is what wheels do. They turn, and the turning includes the stopping. Every year, after the harvest, she did something that her children found strange. She walked into the empty paddy in her bare feet and stood there, in the mud and the shallow water, and she did nothing. She did not plan next year's planting. She did not calculate the yield. She did not think about what could have been done differently. She simply stood in the field that had given everything it had to give. And she let the water cover her feet, and she felt the earth beneath the water, cool and firm and patient, and she said, not aloud, just inside, in the place where the quietest things are said, thank you. And then she said, just as quietly, that is enough. The field heard her. Or perhaps the field did not hear her, and it did not matter, because the words were not for the field. They were for her. They were the permission she gave herself, each year, at the end of the cycle, to stop, to set down the sickle, to wash the mud from her hands, to walk home in the evening light, with nothing in her arms and nothing on her back, and nothing left to carry, until the spring came around again, and the carrying began anew. But that was spring, and this was autumn. And autumn's only job was to be still. She did this every year. Every year, the same standing in the empty field. Every year, the same words, "Thank you, and that is enough." And every year the words felt different, because she was different. The woman who stood in the field at 40 was carrying the weight of young children and a household, and the fierce, tender anxiety of a life that depended on a single harvest. Yumund, Yumada. The woman who stood in the field at 50 was carrying the memory of her mother's death and the slow understanding that the field would outlast everyone who tended it. The woman who stood in the field at 70 was carrying almost nothing. She had set it down, piece by piece, year by year, the way the field set down its rice, not by losing it, but by completing the cycle, by allowing each thing its season, and then letting the season end. She walked home slowly. The path from the paddy to her house was lined with persimmon trees, their branches heavy with fruit the color of sunset, deep orange, almost red, glowing in the late light as though each fruit held a small fire inside it. She did not pick any, not tonight. Tonight, preserved, could hang at branches. The persimmons could hang on their branches, and the field could hold its water, and the mountains could hold the last of the light, and she could walk home with empty hands. And the emptiness was not poverty. It was harvest. It was the harvest after the harvest, the one no one sees, the one that happens inside, when the body finally agrees that the work is done and the resting can begin. And so, here we are, at the end of the stories, at the edge of the quiet that has been gathering all evening, growing deeper with each breath, each word, each moment of lying here, without needing to be anywhere else. Let us do what the rice farmer did. Let us stand in the empty field and feel the earth beneath us and say, quietly, without ceremony, that is enough. Your body has been listening tonight, not just to the words. The body does not care much for words, but to the feeling beneath the words. The settling, the softening, the slow, gentle release of everything that was held too tightly for too long. Let us listen to the body now, not with effort, just with attention. The way you might listen to rain, not trying to hear it, just noticing that it is there, the feet that have carried you through every day of your life, through the long days and the hard ones, and the ones that felt like they would never end. The feet that walked the paths, climbed the stairs, stood in the kitchen, stood in the garden, stood beside hospital beds, and at kitchen counters, and in grocery lines, and on the cold floors of early mornings when the house was dark and the day had not yet begun. The feet are quiet now. They are not going anywhere. They are simply here, resting on the bed, resting on the earth, resting on the same ground that has held every person who has ever lived. Let them be heavy. Let them sink. Let the earth hold them the way it has always held them. Without asking, without needing to be thanked, simply because holding is what the earth does. The ankles, the small, quiet joints that bent without complaint 10,000 times today. Let them soften. Let the tension drain from them like water from a cup, slowly, gently, until they are simply resting, simply still. The legs, The legs that lifted and bent and climbed and knelt, that knelt beside children, beside gardens, beside the bathtub, beside the bed. The legs that carried the weight of the body and everything the body was carrying. They are still now. They are warm. Let the warmth settle deeper. Let the muscles soften. There is nothing to stand for tonight. Nothing to climb. Nothing to kneel beside. The legs can simply be here, long and heavy and warm, two quiet rivers flowing toward rest, the hands. We have spoken of hands all evening. The herbalist's hands, the stonecutter's hands, the midwife's hands, the basket weaver's hands, the candle maker's hands, the ink maker's hands, the bridge keeper's hands, the rice farmer's hands, your hands. Your hands that have held so much. Children and tools and steering wheels and telephones and other hands. And the edges of tables when the world felt like it was tilting. Your hands are empty now. Let them be empty. Let the fingers uncurl. Let the palms turn upward if they want to, the way the herbalists' palms turned upward on the mountain path, holding nothing, receiving everything, open to whatever comes next, which tonight is simply sleep, the arms. The arms that reached and lifted and held and pulled and wrapped around the people you love. The arms that ached at the end of long days, that carried groceries and children and laundry baskets and the invisible weight of everything that needed doing. They are resting now. They are lying at your sides or folded gently across your chest, and the muscles are releasing, fiber by fiber, the way the ferryman's arms released when the oars came to rest in the water. Let them be heavy. Let them be still. Let them remember what it feels like to hold nothing at all. The shoulders that carried the basket, the worry, the weight of everyone else's needs. The shoulders that sat high and tight for so long that you forgot they were not supposed to be there. Let them drop, not all the way, just a fraction, just enough. The bed is holding you. You do not need to hold yourself, the jaw that clenched in the night, that held the words you did not say, that tightened around the things you could not fix. Let it soften. Let the teeth part slightly. Let the tongue rest against the floor of the mouth, heavy and still, like a stone at the bottom of a clear stream. The eyes that have been open all day, watching, scanning, reading, checking, making sure everything was as it should be. The eyes are closed now, or closing. Let them be heavy. Let the lids press gently downward, the way the rice farmer's hands pressed the seedlings into the mud, not with force, but with the quiet certainty that this is where they belong, the chest that held the worry, the love, the ache of caring too much about too many things, the chest where the arrow lived, the quiet arrow the Buddha spoke of, the one that is so hard to see because it has been there so long. The chest is softening now. The ribs are opening, just slightly, the way a fist opens when it has forgotten what it was holding. The heart inside the chest is beating, slowly, steadily, the way it has beaten every moment of your life, carrying you forward without ever being asked, without ever being thanked, the most faithful companion you have ever had. Let it beat. Let it carry you into sleep, the breath. The breath has been here all along, through every story, every teaching, every moment of this evening. It has not asked for your attention. It has not demanded anything. It has simply continued, the way rivers continue, the way the earth continues, the way the old bell continues to hum, long after the strike has faded. Let the breath do what it knows how to do. Let it come in slowly. Let it go out slowly. And in the space between the breaths, in that small, still pause where the exhale has ended and the inhale has not yet begun, there is a quiet so deep that it holds everything. Every story you heard tonight. Every woman who carried something heavy and learned to set it down. Every teaching that pointed gently toward this moment, this breath, this rest. The room around you is quiet. The night outside is quiet. And inside, in the place where the stories have settled, in the muscles and the bones and the soft, warm center of the chest, there is a quiet that is not silence. It is fullness. It is the sound of a body that has finally been heard. The sound of a heart that has finally been allowed to slow down. The sound of a life that is, for this one moment, not asking anything of itself at all. You have carried enough. You have held enough. You have tended and worried and worked and given and stayed awake and kept watch and made sure and held on and held on and held on. And now, like the ferryman resting his oars, like the herbalist setting down her basket, like the bell ringer listening to the silence after the strike, like the rice farmer standing barefoot in the empty field, you can stop, not forever, just for tonight. The earth is holding you. It has always been holding you. Through every night of your life, through every season, through the long years of carrying and the longer years of learning to set things down. It held the herbalist on her mountain. It held the ferryman on his river. It held the stonecutter, the midwife, the basket weaver, the candle maker, the ink maker, the bridge keeper, the glassblower, the weaver, the laundress, the rice farmer standing barefoot in her empty field. It held them all, and it holds you now, steady and patient and unchanged, ready for whatever the new day asks. But that is morning, and this is now, and now is for resting. The old teachings we have walked through tonight, bara, the weight that is not yours to carry. Patinisaga, the giving back of what was never meant to be kept. Vedana, the body's quiet record of everything it has held. Vosaga, the courage of the open hand. Pasadi, the calm that follows. Effort. Nekama, the wisdom of stepping out of the stream. Lahuta, the lightness that was always yours. These are not instructions. They are invitations. You do not need to remember them. They have already settled into the place where the stories live. Somewhere, deeper than memory. Somewhere the body keeps the things that matter most. Lice meet well. Sleep gently. Sleep the way the field sleeps after the harvest. Empty, peaceful, already dreaming of spring. If these stories brought you a moment of peace tonight, you might consider subscribing to Moonlit Dharma, where new stories arrive each week to help a weary mind find rest. A like, a comment, or a share helps others find their way to this quiet place. And if you know someone who has been carrying too much for too long, someone whose shoulders are tired and whose hands are full, perhaps you could send this their way. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for someone we love is to remind them that they are allowed to stop. Until next time, may you carry lightly and may the road be kind.